The sun over the New Mexico plains in the year of our Lord 1852 was not a giver of life, but a taker of it. It beat down upon the cracked earth with a relentless, white-hot fury, bleaching the sky to a pale, hazy blue and stripping the color from everything it touched. It was a hammer, and the land was its anvil. Morgan Hale knew this sun. He had been born under it, had buried his wife beneath it, and now he rode through it, his face a mask of tanned leather and quiet grief, the brim of his hat pulled low to cast a sliver of shadow over his eyes. He was a man forged in silence, a widower whose words had become as scarce as water in this parched territory. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of his small ranch, the lone juniper, and the familiar, comforting presence of his cattle. Now, even that small world was fractured. A handful of calves, spooked by a coyote or perhaps just the whispering devil of the wind, had strayed from the herd. For 2 days, Morgan had tracked them, his steady buckskin, Gideon, picking a careful path through the treacherous terrain of the San Miguel Wash. The wash was a scar on the face of the land, a dry riverbed choked with sun-baked stones, skeletal mesquite, and the ever-present, whispering dust. The air was so still you could hear the buzz of a fly a dozen yards away, the creak of Morgan's saddle leather, the soft plod of Gideon's hooves in the fine, red sand. It was a silence that could drive a man mad, but for Morgan, it was a familiar blanket. He reined Gideon to a halt, his gaze fixed not on the faint tracks of the calves, but on a dense clump of creosote bush that seemed out of place, too thick and green for this desolate stretch. He wasn't looking at it, but listening past it. A sound, small and unnatural, had snagged his attention. It was a faint, metallic clink, followed by a soft scraping noise, not a sound made by wind or beast. It was the sound of man, or the things man left behind, dismounting. Morgan moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life spent in hard country. He was not a large man, but wiry and tough, his frame all lean muscle and bone. He drew the Colt from his hip, its weight a familiar comfort in his palm, and approached the bush. He parted the brittle branches, the sharp, resinous scent of the creosote filling the air. Behind it lay a dark maw in the earth, an old, abandoned well. Its stone lip was crumbling, and laid haphazardly across the opening were several planks of weathered, rotting wood. The sound came again, a faint scrape, as if something below had shifted. Morgan holstered his pistol and, with a grunt of effort, pulled one of the heavy planks aside. The sunlight pierced the darkness below, illuminating a scene that made the breath catch in his throat. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a lost prospector. It was a girl. She was at the bottom of the 10-foot shaft, her back pressed against the curved stone wall. She was native, perhaps Apache or Navajo, her dark hair matted with dust and sweat, her buckskin dress torn at the shoulder. Her hands were bound in front of her with the cruel, fibrous strands of a yucca rope, pulled so tight the circulation had turned her fingers a dusky shade of purple. But it was the thing around her neck that held Morgan's gaze, that made a cold knot of anger tighten in his gut. Hanging from a leather thong was a rough-hewn plank of wood, no bigger than a book. Scrawled across it in what looked like charcoal were 4 stark, ugly words: "White men don't forgive." Her head was bowed, but as his shadow fell over her, she looked up. Her eyes, dark and wide with a terror that had long since burned past tears, were rimmed with red, irritated by the ceaseless grit. Her lips were cracked and swollen. She took a sharp, ragged breath that was more a gasp for air than a true inhalation, her chest rising and falling in a frantic, shallow rhythm. She was dying of thirst and heat, cooked alive at the bottom of this forgotten hole. For a long moment, Morgan stood frozen at the well's edge, the world shrinking to the circle of darkness and the suffering girl within it. This was not his business. He was a man who had actively sought to sever his ties with the world's troubles. He had calves to find, a ranch to run, a solitude to maintain. This girl was a hornet's nest, a rattlesnake in a boot, a complication he could not afford. The sign around her neck was a clear warning, a statement of ownership and intent. Whoever put her here meant for her to be found this way. They would not take kindly to a stranger's interference. Gideon snorted behind him, a soft, impatient sound that broke the spell. Morgan looked back at his horse, then down again into the well. He saw not just a native girl, but the raw, brutal injustice of it. He saw the face of the men who had done this, faceless, arrogant, secure in their power. And in the girl's eyes, he saw a flicker of something beyond fear, a stubborn ember of life that refused to be extinguished. Cursing under his breath, a low rumble of frustration at himself and the world that had brought this to his path. He turned back to his saddle. He uncoiled his lariat, the worn hemp smooth in his calloused hands. Securing one end to the sturdy pommel of his saddle, he tossed the other down into the well, the loop landing softly in the dust near her feet. "I'm coming down," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. It was the first thing he'd said aloud all day. He didn't wait for a response he knew she couldn't give. He gripped the rope and, with the practiced ease of a man who knew his own strength, lowered himself into the shaft. He moved like a shadow, his boots finding purchase on the rough-hewn stones of the wall, the darkness enveloping him, cool and smelling of damp earth and despair. He landed softly beside her. Up close, her condition was even worse. The skin on her wrists was raw and bleeding where she had struggled against the yucca fibers. A deep purple bruise was blooming on her cheekbone. He could hear her breathing now, a dry, rasping sound that tore at his insides. He drew his skinning knife from the sheath on his belt. The blade gleamed dully in the dim light. He reached for her bonds, the steel hovering just over the yucca rope. And then he hesitated, just for a single, thudding heartbeat. This was the final line. Once cut, there was no going back. He would be part of her story, and she, part of his. The quiet life he had so carefully constructed would be over. The men who wrote that sign would come looking for their property, and they would not be happy to find it gone. As if sensing his hesitation, the girl let out a low, guttural moan, a sound of such profound and bottomless pain that it sliced through Morgan's caution like a razor. It was the sound his wife, Mary, had made in her final hours, a sound he had prayed to God he would never hear again. The hesitation vanished, burned away by a sudden, fierce protectiveness. His knife came down in a swift, clean stroke, severing the first strand of yucca, then another and another, until her hands fell free, limp and useless in her lap. She slumped forward, her strength completely gone. Morgan sheathed his knife and gently shrugged out of his canvas duster. The fabric was stiff with trail dust and smelled of horse and wood smoke, but it was a layer of protection, a small comfort. He draped it carefully around her thin shoulders. He knew he couldn't climb the rope while carrying her. He looked up, his eyes tracing the path of the lariat. The old well likely had a pulley system once. He squinted, and there, half hidden in the shadows near the lip, was a rusted iron hook where a wheel must have hung. "Stay here," he whispered. An unnecessary command. He scaled the rope with a speed that belied his earlier caution, his muscles straining as he hauled himself back into the blinding sunlight. He worked quickly, his mind clear and focused. He looped his lariat over the hook, creating a crude but effective pulley. He lowered the end back down, then descended once more into the well. This time, he was all business. He gathered the unconscious girl into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile bundle of bones and spirit. He looped the rope securely under her arms, making a makeshift harness, then began the arduous task of pulling her up. He braced his feet against the well wall, his back screaming in protest, and hauled, hand over fist. The rope bit into his palms as he slowly, carefully, raised her from her tomb, up into the light and air. When she was safely on the ground, he clambered out, his own breathing now heavy in the oppressive heat. She lay still, passed out from the ordeal, her chest rising and falling in a more regular rhythm. As he knelt beside her, a small object tucked into the collar of her dress caught his eye. It was a small amulet made of two striking blue feathers, perhaps from a jay or a bluebird tied together with a strip of sinew. As he leaned over her, the amulet swung free and gently tapped against his chest, a soft, rhythmic beat like a strange and foreign heartbeat sounding against his own. He gave her a few sips of water from his canteen, letting it dribble over her cracked lips. She stirred but didn't wake. He stood, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt, and scanned the horizon in a slow, 360-degree turn. There was nothing. No riders silhouetted against the sky, no telltale plume of dust. Just the vast, indifferent emptiness of the plains, the whisper of the hot wind, and the endless shimmering heat haze. His eyes fell to the ground near the well. The tracks were clear in the dust. 3 riders, their horses were shod. Not the unshod ponies of a nomadic tribe. One of the horses had a distinctive nick in its left hind shoe. They had come from the east, from the direction of Coyote's Mercy, the nearest collection of saloons, stables, and broken dreams that passed for a town, and they had ridden back the same way. A cold certainty settled in Morgan's stomach. This was white men's work. The sign was not a lie, but a boast. He looked down at the girl. Leaving her here was a death sentence. The men would either come back to finish the job, or the sun would do it for them. Taking her to Coyote's Mercy was just as dangerous. A town full of men who would see the $500 of a bounty before they saw the humanity in a person. There was only one other option. He made his decision, gently. He lifted her again, her head lolling against his shoulder. He carried her to Gideon, who stood patiently, unperturbed. With some difficulty, he managed to settle her in the saddle, sitting her sideways in front of him. She was a dead weight, her body pliant and unresponsive. As he arranged her, he saw the angry, raw rope burns on her neck where the sign had chafed against her skin. He leaned close to her ear, his voice a low whisper meant only for her, a counterspell to the curse that hung in the air. "I'm not the man who wrote that sign." He knew, with a sinking feeling that settled deep in his bones, that this act was a lit match tossed into the dry kindling of his quiet life. Trouble was coming. It would ride in on 3 shod horses, and it would come for him. But as he looked at the brutalized girl in his arms, he found he didn't care. Some things were more important than quiet. He swung himself up into the saddle behind her, taking the reins in one hand and circling his other arm around her waist to hold her steady. He nudged Gideon with his heels, turning the horse away from the abandoned well, away from the faint tracks of the calves, and toward the west, toward the distant, hazy shape of the lone juniper tree that marked his ranch. He was choosing this path. He was choosing this trouble. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brilliant streaks of orange and purple, the girl stirred against him. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and cloudy with pain. She tried to speak, her voice a dry, hoarse croak. A single, desperate plea. "Don't! Leave!" Morgan tightened his arm around her, a gesture of reassurance, of promise. The sun was in his eyes, but he didn't look away from the horizon, from the future he was now riding headlong into. "I'm here," he said softly, and he spurred Gideon into a steady trot, racing the coming darkness, a lone rider carrying a forgotten soul into the heart of the unforgiving West. The ride to Lone Juniper had been a blur of sunset and rising dust. Morgan had felt the girl he couldn't keep calling her the girl in his mind. It felt too cold, too much like what those men had seen go limp against him, falling into the deep exhaustion of trauma and dehydration. He'd held her steady, his arm locked around her waist, the small, hard angle of her hip pressing into his side. He rode with a tense vigilance, his eyes scanning the ridgelines, expecting the silhouettes of riders against the twilight, but nothing came, only the wind and the night. His cabin was a single room, built of sturdy pine logs, chinked with mud and straw. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and the faint, dusty scent of the high desert. It was the smell of his solitude. He eased her off Gideon, his muscles straining as he lifted her dead weight. She moaned, a soft, animal sound. As he carried her over the threshold, he laid her gently on his own bed, a rope-strung frame with a straw-stuffed mattress that was, at least, clean. In the dim light of the single lantern he lit, she looked smaller, younger, and infinitely more broken than she had in the well. Her breathing was still shallow, a hitching, dusty sound. First, water. He brought a dipper from the bucket, but her lips were too cracked and swollen to drink. He dipped a corner of a clean rag in the water and gently moistened her mouth. She licked at the damp cloth, her eyes fluttering but not opening. Then, the fire. He moved to the hearth, his motions economical. He split dry kindling with a small hatchet, the sharp thwack of the steel on wood the only sound. He built the fire with the careful hands of a man who lives alone, striking a sulfur match on the hearthstone. The flame caught, orange light flickering across the room, illuminating her still form on the bed. He filled a black iron kettle with water and set it on the hook over the growing flames. While it heated, he surveyed the damage. The yucca fibers had done their work. Her wrists were a mess of raw, chafed skin, caked with drying blood and red sand. Her ankle, he saw now, was swollen to nearly twice its normal size. A deep, angry purple. She must have twisted it in the well, or perhaps they had done it to her before. He pulled up the cabin's only stool. He did not look at her face. He kept his eyes fixed on the task, a deliberate act of respect. He was a man, she was a woman, and the circumstances were fraught. He would treat this like he was mending a delicate piece of harness, or setting a splint on a newborn calf with focus, and a distance that was its own kind of kindness. When the water was warm, he poured it into a tin basin, adding a splash of cold to temper the heat. He brought the basin, the rag, and a bar of harsh lye soap to the bedside. "Gonna clean these cuts," he said, his voice low. He didn't know if she could hear him, or if she'd even understand his words. He dipped the rag. She flinched as the warm water touched her raw skin, her whole body tensing like a wire. Her eyes snapped open, wide and dark, locking onto his face. It was the first time she had truly looked at him, and her gaze was pure, undiluted terror. Morgan froze. His hand, rough as pine bark and scarred from rope burns and brandings, hovered in the air. "Easy," he whispered. "Just easy. The grit'll fester if I leave it." He didn't move, holding his hand still, the dripping rag a truce offering. He let her watch him, let her see his face, let her measure the intent in his eyes. He was not the man from the well. He would not move again until she allowed it. The seconds ticked by, measured in the unsteady rhythm of her breathing. Finally, the tension in her shoulders eased by a fraction. She didn't look away, but the panic in her eyes receded, replaced by a dull, exhausted watchfulness. He took that as permission. Slowly, he touched the rag to her wrist. He worked with a painstaking gentleness, his large, calloused fingers moving as if they were handling spun glass, carefully washing away the sand and the blood. He worked in silence, his every movement slow and broadcast, giving her time to react, to stop him, but she only watched, silent and still. When her wrists were clean, he moved to her ankle. He had to lift her leg, and he did so by sliding his hand under her heel, avoiding any grip that could be misinterpreted. The swelling was bad. He wrapped it tightly in a cloth soaked in cold water from the bucket to try and bring it down. He found other, smaller cuts on her arms, her cheek, and he cleaned them, too. He went to his supply chest and pulled out a small tin of bear grease, pungent with pine. It was his cure-all for cuts, burns, and chapped skin. He returned to her side and, dipping 2 fingers in the salve, gently applied it to the rope burns. His touch was clinical, impersonal. Yet the warmth of his hand against her skin was the first human contact she'd had that wasn't violence. She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking a clean path through the dust on her cheek. He found clean strips of cotton and bandaged her wrists and her ankle, his knots firm but not tight. Through it all, she never made a sound. Her silence was vast. It filled the cabin, heavier than the furniture. He found himself thinking, trying to place her. Apache, maybe. He'd heard a Mexican mail courier, a man named Ricardo, use a word once for the moonlight that spilled over the high plains. Nayeli. He didn't know what tribe it came from, or if it was even a name, but it settled in his mind. It fit the silver light in her dark, watchful eyes. He would call her Nayeli, if only to himself. The cabin was too quiet. He moved to the hearth, his own stomach growling. A pot of beans from that morning was still hanging, and he stirred it. The sound of the metal spoon scraping against the cast-iron pot abnormally loud. Scrape, clink, scrape. Outside. The wind had picked up. The small weather vane on top of his well, a rusted tin rooster, had a loose bearing. It began to squeak, a high, repetitive, metallic complaint against the rising wind. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Between the scraping spoon, the creaking vane, and the whistling wind, another sound threaded itself into the night the girl's breathing. It was deeper now, more regular. The shallow pants of panic had given way to the slow, heavy cadence of deep exhaustion. She was falling asleep. Morgan ate his beans standing by the fire, his mind racing. He couldn't stay in here. Not with her. It wasn't right. It wouldn't feel safe for her, and frankly, it didn't feel right for him. This was Mary's room, Mary's bed. The thought of sleeping on the floor felt like a violation of two different kinds. He looked at her. She had curled onto her side, facing the wall, as small as a child. He owned one good blanket, a heavy Navajo wool weave, thick and warm, patterned in red and black. It had been Mary's. He took it from the chest at the foot of the bed and unfolded it. He draped it over her, tucking it gently around her shoulders. She sighed in her sleep, burrowing into the warmth. He turned and grabbed his canvas bedroll and cot from the corner. He walked to the door, unfolding the cot and setting it up on the narrow plank porch. It was protected by the overhang, but the night air was already sharp with cold. He'd be fine. He paused in the doorway, looking back into the firelit room. She was asleep, but her safety was a fragile thing. What if she woke, terrified, in a strange place? What if she thought he had locked her in? He thought about his rifle, propped by the door. No, that was his. He thought about his Colt, still heavy on his hip. He unbuckled the gun belt and laid it on the table. Then he walked back to the bed, on the small, rough-hewn shelf above her head, where he kept his shaving razor and a few spare cartridges. He placed his skinning knife. The blade was sharp, the handle worn smooth to his grip. He laid it down and pushed it forward. The worn antler hilt pointed toward her, well within her reach. It was a promise. It was a statement. You are not a prisoner. I am not your enemy. You have the power to protect yourself. With that, he turned, pulled the heavy cabin door most of the way shut, leaving it open just a crack, and went to his cot on the porch. Morgan did not sleep. He lay on his back, hands clasped behind his head, listening to the sounds of the high desert night. The wind was a lonely thing, a mournful coyote howl that found every crack in his cabin's chinking. It was a whistle, a moan, a sigh. And with every sudden gust that rattled the door, with every sharp squeak from the well vane, his body would jolt, his hand instinctively grabbing for the pistol he'd left on the porch planks beside him. His mind was not in the cabin. It was back at the San Miguel wash. He was back at the lip of that dark hole. He saw the sign, "White Men Don't Forgive." He saw the shod hoofprints of the three riders. He saw the direction they had ridden Coyote's mercy. He had brought their trouble home. He had invited it right across his threshold. He thought of Mary, of the quiet life he had tried to build on this harsh land. A life of simple penance. And now, that life was over, burned away by the single act of cutting a yucca rope. Dawn came not as a light, but as a lessening of the dark. A gray, cold smear in the east. He rose, his joints stiff from the cold cot, and pulled on his boots. Inside the cabin, Nayeli woke to the unfamiliar warmth. The first thing she registered was the pain, a dull, throbbing ache in her ankle and a sharp sting in her wrists. But she was warm. She was on a soft surface. She wasn't in the well. Her eyes opened, darting, assessing. She was in a small, square room made of wood. A dying fire glowed in a stone hearth. She was alone. Her terror spiked, and she tried to sit up, but her muscles screamed in protest. Her hand brushed against the shelf by her head. Her fingers closed around the antler hilt of the knife. She gripped it, a small, cold piece of security. She scanned the room again. Her gaze fell on the doorway, and she saw them. A pair of men's work boots, caked in mud and dust, were placed just outside the open door. On the porch, they were set neatly, side by side, as if awaiting their owner. He hadn't come in. The man who had pulled her from the well, the man whose scent of leather and wood smoke was on the blanket covering her, had slept outside. He had left her the cabin, the fire, and the knife. He had respected the boundary of the threshold. This small gesture, the placement of a pair of muddy boots, was a louder statement of safety than any words he could have spoken. Slowly, carefully, she relaxed her grip on the knife, though she did not let it go. Her other hand moved to her neck. The leather thong was still there. The blue feather amulet, the symbol of her family, the Firebird people, was tucked safely beneath her torn dress. He had cleaned her wounds, but he had not taken her identity. She held the feathers, drawing a flicker of strength from them, and remained silent. She heard him then, the soft tread of his return. He stopped at the door, hesitating, not wanting to startle her. He made a small sound, a clearing of his throat. She watched him enter. He was carrying a small tin bowl. He didn't approach the bed, but stood near the hearth, keeping the width of the room between them. The bowl steamed, smelling of corn and water. He set it down on the floor, about 3 feet from the bed, not in her lap, not on the shelf. He placed it an arm's length away, a neutral offering. It was her choice to take it. "When you're ready," he said, his voice the same low rumble as the night before. "Eat." He turned to tend the fire, to give her the dignity of not being watched. But as he turned, she let out a small, almost imperceptible sound, a dry click of her tongue. Morgan stopped. He looked back at her. Their eyes met. It was not the terrified glance in the well. It was not the hazy, pain-filled gaze of the ride. For a full, suspended 5 seconds, they simply looked at each other. His gaze was steady, gray as a winter sky, complicated by a weariness she was just beginning to understand. Hers was dark, deep, and fiercely intelligent, a silent assessment that weighed his soul. In that single, shared look, 1,000 questions were asked and answered without a sound. A fragile, invisible thing was forged in the silence, the first delicate thread of trust. He was the first to look away. He gave a single, sharp nod, as if accepting a bargain, and turned back to the fire. As he added a log to the embers, his gaze drifted to the corner of the room. An old, forgotten thing was tacked to the wall, a paper calendar, brittle with age, from some traveling pastor. It was 2 years out of date. Mary had put it up. As the morning breeze ghosted through the open door, it lifted the corner of the top page, making it flutter. It was just a piece of paper, irrelevant, but it moved, alive with the same wind that had brought the storm of the previous day. A silent witness in the corner of the changing room. For 2 days, the cabin at Lone Juniper existed in a state of suspended reality. The world was reduced to the 4 log walls, the slow feeding of the fire, and the quiet, almost imperceptible rhythm of healing. Nayeli, as he had come to call her in the chambers of his mind, began to mend. The rawness of her wrists faded to a dark, bruised purple. The swelling in her ankle subsided, though she still could not put her weight on it. She moved from the bed to the stool by the fire, her motions stiff and painful. But she moved. She remained a creature of silence. She ate the broth and corn mush he left for her, her eyes tracking his every move. She was a hawk, perched and wary, her stillness a form of armor. Morgan respected it. He moved around her as he would a skittish colt, speaking in low tones, not about her or the well, but about the mundane. "Fire's getting low. Gonna check the stock." He gave her the cabin during the day, busying himself with the endless, Sisyphean tasks of a lone rancher mending harness, reinforcing his small corral, chopping wood. But the peace was a thin sheet of ice over a deep, fast-moving river. The image of the 3-shod hoofprints leading toward Coyote's mercy was burned into his mind. They were not drifters. Drifters didn't use new yucca rope. Drifters didn't write signs. They were hunters, and they would come to see if their trap had been sprung. On the morning of the third day, Morgan's unease crystallized into a cold, hard certainty. He'd ridden out at dawn, not to find his lost calves, they were long gone, swallowed by the desert or a wolf's belly, but to cut for sign. He rode Gideon in a wide, cautious perimeter around his property, his eyes on the ground, not the horizon. He found it 2 miles east, near the edge of the wash where the ground was hardpan, unforgiving of any but the clearest mark. It was a boot print, not a worn-down cowboy boot. This was military issue. The sole was thick, stamped with a government number he couldn't quite make out, the heel plate distinct. And the heel itself was worn in a specific, telling way, canted, and worn down hard on the outside of the left foot. It was the mark of a man who'd spent years on horseback, a cavalryman. The print was fresh, no more than a day old. He dismounted, crouching low. The rider had stopped here, perhaps to get his bearings. Morgan's gaze swept the ground, particle by particle. His fingers brushed against something small and metallic, half hidden under the lip of a flat rock. He picked it up, a brass cartridge casing, .44 caliber. It glinted, warm from the morning sun. He stood, rolling the casing in his calloused palm, a .44, not the heavy .50 caliber of a buffalo gun, nor the common .36 of a Navy Colt. It was a powerful handgun round, or perhaps from a lever-action rifle. It was the choice of a man who hunted men. This was it, the shod horse, the cavalry boot, the .44 casing. This was not a random act of frontier cruelty. This was an organized hunt. His stomach tightened. The man had been close, scouting. He had scouted Lone Juniper. Morgan slipped the casing into his vest pocket, the small piece of brass heavy as a cannonball. He swung onto Gideon, his face a grim mask, and rode hard for home. He saw the dust cloud when he was still a mile out, a single rider, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. They weren't coming from the east, from the wash, but from the north, from the thin ribbon of wagon ruts that led to Coyote's Mercy. This was not the cavalryman. This was something else. He burst into the cabin, his urgency a sudden, sharp crack in the quiet. Nayeli, who was sitting on the floor, carefully stretching her injured ankle, flinched, her hand flying to the knife he had left on the shelf. "Someone's coming," he said, his voice low and hard. "Get behind the curtain. Don't move. Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." Her eyes widened, the familiar terror flooding back, but she didn't hesitate. She scrambled, wincing as she put weight on her foot, and disappeared behind the thin cotton sheet he'd strung across the corner for her privacy. Morgan grabbed his rifle, checked the load, and then, deliberately, set it against the wall inside the door. Within reach, but not in his hand, he stepped onto the porch, pulling his hat low, and leaned against the upright post, forcing a posture of casual boredom. He crossed one boot over the other, his arms folded. He became, for all appearances, a man at rest. Inside, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The rider resolved out of the dust. He was a broad man on a tired-looking sorrel. He wore a long, greasy duster despite the heat, and a tin star was pinned crookedly to his vest. The star was tarnished, its authority questionable. This was Hollis Crane, the self-appointed deputy of Coyote's Mercy, a man who fed on rumor and wielded the fear of the law without any of its integrity. He was a vulture in a man's shape. Crane pulled his horse up 10 yards from the porch. He didn't dismount. He sat in the saddle, his hands resting on his pommel, and let his eyes do the walking. They raked over the cabin, the empty corral, the squeaking weather vane on the well, and finally settled on Morgan. "Hail," he said, his voice a lazy drawl that didn't match the quickness of his eyes. "Crane," Morgan replied. The single word was flat, offering nothing. Crane spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Long ride out here. A man gets thirsty." "Barrel's by the door," Morgan said, not moving. "Help yourself." Crane smirked. Always so friendly. He swung a leg over, his worn boot hitting the ground. He was a big man, running to fat, but he moved with a practiced, deliberate heaviness. He ambled to the water barrel, dipped the tin cup, and drank noisily, water dripping into his unkempt beard. He didn't turn his back to Morgan. "Word is," Crane said, wiping his mouth on his sleeve, "you've been busy." "Out by the San Miguel wash." Morgan's posture didn't change. "Just checking my fences. Found some calves strayed." "Is that all?" Crane's eyes glittered. "Funny. I heard you found something else. Something breathing." The air became still. The squeak of the weather vane was the only sound. A high, thin nerve being plucked. "Don't know what you heard." "Crane," Morgan said, his voice like dry gravel. "I just got cattle. And a dry well." He used the words "dry well" intentionally, a cast into the dark water to see what would bite. Crane's eyes narrowed. Just a fraction. He knew. He knew about the well. "A man ought to be careful what he picks up," Crane said, stepping closer to the porch, into Morgan's shadow. "Some things don't belong to him. Some things belong to other folks. If you've got business here, state it," Morgan said, his patience wearing thin. "Otherwise, I've got work." "Oh, I got business." Crane chuckled. A low, unpleasant sound. He reached inside his duster and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He flicked it open. Official business. He held it up. It was a wanted poster. The paper was cheap, the ink already fading, but the image, a crude charcoal sketch, was unmistakable. It was her. It was Nayeli. The likeness was poor, an exaggeration of her features, but the eyes were right dark, wide, and haunted. Beneath the sketch, bold letters proclaimed her a fugitive. Wanted, Apache Squaw, name unknown, for the murder of Eliza Pike, wife of rancher Ransom Pike, for arson. In the burning of the Red Mesa military outpost, $500 reward. Morgan's blood went cold. $500. It was a fortune. It was enough to make a saint turn killer. It was enough to turn every man in the territory into a hunter. He kept his face blank, a mask of stone. He let his eyes scan the paper with deliberate, mild disinterest. He saw the name Ransom Pike, a big rancher from the high country, near Red Mesa, a man with land, money, and influence. Morgan met Crane's gaze. "Don't recognize her." "You sure?" Crane pressed, a predatory grin spreading across his face. $500. Hail. That'd buy a lot of new calves. Might even pay for a man to dig a new well. Morgan pushed himself off the post, his movement unhurried. He took the poster from Crane's hand. He held it for a second, feeling the flimsy paper. He looked at the crude drawing, then at the accusation. Murder, arson. He knew, with the same certainty that he knew the sun would rise, that it was a lie. It was the same lie as the sign in the well. He folded the paper neatly and handed it back to Crane. "Haven't seen her," he said, his voice final. "If I do, I'll be sure to let you know." Crane's smile vanished. He knew he was being lied to. Morgan knew he knew. The lie hung between them, thick and heavy as summer humidity. Crane snatched the poster back, stuffing it into his pocket. "You do that, Hale." He spat. His eyes flicked to the cabin door, to the thin curtain visible just inside. "A man alone, like you people talk. They wonder if you've gotten lonely. Wonder if you might take in a stray." "The only thing I've taken in is the cold," Morgan said. "Now get off my land." Crane held his gaze for a long moment. A silent battle of wills fought in the dusty yard. Then he grunted, turned without another word, and heaved himself back onto his sorrel. He wheeled the horse, kicking up a spray of dust that settled on the porch. $500 makes a man's neighbors mighty observant. "Hale," Crane called back over his shoulder. "Keep your eyes peeled." Morgan watched him until he was just another dust cloud, a brown smudge against the blue sky. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, the tension draining from his shoulders, leaving him weary. He turned and went inside. The cabin was silent. The curtain was perfectly still. "He's gone." He heard a small sound, a gasp, a choked-back sob. He walked to the corner and pulled the curtain aside. Nayeli was huddled on the floor, her back pressed to the log wall. She was gripping the curtain fabric in her fists, her knuckles bone white. She was shaking, a tremor that ran through her entire body. But as she looked up at him, he saw it wasn't just fear in her eyes. It was a deep, burning, bottomless rage. The poster had been more than an accusation. It had been an accelerant. That night, the fragile peace of the cabin was gone, replaced by the grim reality of the hunt. The threat was no longer a faceless they. It was Deputy Hollis Crane. It was Ransom Pike. It was a $500 bounty that painted a target on her back, and his, after she had fallen into a fitful, exhausted sleep by the fire. Morgan went to the barn. He lit a single lantern, the yellow light casting long, dancing shadows among the stalls. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity. This was no longer just about hiding. This was about running. He pulled his own saddle from the rack, checking the cinch for wear. Then he went to a dark corner and pulled a dusty tarp off an old, forgotten object, Mary's side saddle. It was smaller, lighter, the leather stiff but sound. He began to work it with saddle soap, his hands moving in slow, practiced circles, bringing the dead leather back to life. He checked his rifle again, laying out his cartridges, counting them. 30 rounds, not enough. He filled 2 canteens from the well, the squeak of the pulley loud in the night air. He filled his water skin, too. He packed a canvas sack with dried beef, a small bag of cornmeal, and his whetstone. He was building an escape. He was about to blow out the lantern when his eye caught something on the hard-packed dirt floor, just inside the barn door where he'd swept it clean. He moved closer, holding the lantern high. It was a drawing, scratched into the earth with a piece of charcoal from the cold forge. It was simple, rendered with a shaking hand, but its meaning was unmistakable. It was a bird. Its wings were spread wide, as if in flight, and from its body and wings, sharp, jagged lines radiated outward, lines of fire, a bird consumed by, or bursting from, a conflagration. He stared at it for a long time. She had been out here. While he was checking the perimeter, she had dragged herself to the barn. This was her first message, her first word. A bird in flames. He walked back to the cabin. She was awake. She sat where he had left her, a small, dark shape wrapped in the Navajo blanket, staring into the glowing embers of the fire. He stood in the doorway, the sack and canteens in his hand. The drawing was an invitation, an explanation. He sat on the stool opposite her, keeping the hearth between them. The fire licked at a piece of pine, a soft, crackling pop that punctuated the silence. He didn't ask about the drawing. He just waited. She looked up, her face half in shadow, half in the warm, red light. Her throat worked, and he could see the effort it took to force sound past her lips. When her voice came, it was a hoarse whisper, rough as sandstone. "My people," she said, the words catching. We're marked by fire." The sentence hung in the air. Fragmented but complete. Fire. The arson charge on the poster. Marked by fire. It wasn't an act she had committed. It was an act that had been done to her. Morgan nodded slowly, processing the weight of her words. He looked from her face, etched with a pain so deep it looked ancient, to the fire in the hearth, and back. He could feel the shape of the truth, a monstrous, dark thing, just outside the light. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped. He didn't offer empty comfort. He didn't offer false promises. He offered the only thing he had. "If you want to tell me," he said, his voice quiet but steady as bedrock, "I'll listen. If not," he paused, "I'll keep watch." She held his gaze. Her eyes, which had held nothing but terror and then rage, softened, just for a moment. She saw him. He wasn't a savior. He wasn't an enemy. He was just a man, holding a lantern in the dark. She gave a single, slow nod. The fire crackled. Luck, 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 eating the dry wood, in the small cabin. surrounded by a hostile territory and a closing net. A new, fragile thing had just taken root. It was not hope. Not yet. It was something far more basic and far more powerful. It was trust. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing, orange coals that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light, like a sleeping heart. Outside, the wind had found a new voice. No longer a whistle, but a low, mournful moan that flowed around the corners of the cabin and pressed against the door. Inside, the silence stretched, thick and alive. Morgan sat on his stool, Nayeli on the floor, the Navajo blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She had not spoken since her whispered confession about the fire. She stared into the embers. But Morgan knew she wasn't seeing them. She was seeing something else, a memory replaying in the theater of the coals. He gave her the silence, letting it be a space for her to gather the pieces of her story. He knew from his own grief that memory was not a straight road. It was a fractured landscape, full of chasms and treacherous paths, and a person had to find their own way across. Finally, she spoke again, her voice so low it was almost part of the wind's song. "It was the last moon of winter," she began, her gaze fixed on the dying fire. "The cold was a blade. Eliza Pike was found in her own home, Ransom Pike's wife." She paused, her breath catching. "Pike is a man with a shadow in his own house. His brother is a drunkard, violent. He lived with them. There were whispers, arguments that carried on the wind, sounds of breaking glass. Eliza had bruises she would try to hide at the trading post. She traced a line in the dust on the floor with her finger. When she was found, the story was that our men, on a raid for food, had done it. But our men do not harm women. It is not our way, and we were starving. But not so much that we had lost our honor. The story came in fragments, like pieces of a broken pot she was trying to assemble. Pike needed someone to blame, someone easy, someone no one would defend. Her hand clenched into a fist in the dust. He has wanted the land around Red Mesa for a long time. Our land. He said the spirits of the mountains spooked his cattle. But it was not the spirits he wanted gone. It was us. Morgan listened, his own hands resting on his knees. He pictured it the big rancher, Pike, with a dark secret in his family, looking for a scapegoat, a convenient lie that served a greedy purpose. It was a story as old as the land itself. "The soldiers from the outpost came with him," she whispered, and a tremor ran through her. "And men from the town. Crane was with them. They had been drinking. Their faces were red in the torchlight. Their eyes empty." She fell silent, her body swaying slightly. The memory was a physical weight. "They came at night. We were sleeping. The first thing I knew was the smell of smoke, kerosene, the canvas of our lodge. It went up like dry grass, a wall of orange." Her breathing quickened. "There was screaming, the sound of shots. My father, he went out with his hands raised, to speak, to calm them. They—" She choked on the word. She didn't have to finish. Morgan could see the flash of the rifle, the crumpled form in the firelight. "My mother was trapped. The burning canvas had fallen on her. She was tangled in a sleeping robe. I had a knife, a small one, for skinning rabbits. I was trying to cut her free. That is when they found me." She looked up at Morgan, her eyes dark pools of memory. "They dragged me out. They held up the knife. They called it a weapon. They said I had used it on Eliza Pike. They said I was trying to use it on them. The injustice of it was so profound, so simple and so absolute, that it left no room for error in the cabin. She was trying to save her mother, and they had twisted it into an act of aggression. They had written their own story on top of hers, and their story was the one that carried the weight of guns and badges. "They hit me," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. "They wanted to know where the others were, the ones who had escaped into the rocks. I did not know, so they took me to the well." She shuddered, a violent, full-body convulsion. "They said they would leave me there, as bait. They said my people would not be able to resist coming for me. And when they came, they would be waiting." She finally looked away from the fire and met his gaze. "The sign," she said, her voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper. "The one you found me with. It was not for me. It was for anyone who might find me. Any trapper, any traveler, any white man. It was a warning. This one is ours. She is marked. Do not interfere." It was a way to make everyone their accomplice, to make the whole world turn its back. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was a psychological trap, as carefully constructed as any deadfall. It used fear and prejudice as its jaws, and Morgan had walked right into it and set her free. He said nothing. He simply held her gaze, letting her know he had heard, that he understood. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was a shared space, filled with the ghosts of her story. He saw the fire, smelled the smoke, heard the screams, and in the red glow of the embers, his own ghosts began to stir. He found himself speaking, his voice rougher than usual, the words pulled from a place he kept locked away. "I had a sister," he said. The words felt strange on his tongue. He had not said her name aloud in 5 years. Mabel. Nayeli's eyes, full of her own pain, widened slightly, focusing on him. She was listening. She was younger than me, all laughter and quick hands. She could braid a horse's mane so it looked like woven silk. He looked down at his own hands, calloused and clumsy by comparison. We had a small place back in the territories. Before this one, my PA had just passed, and it was just me and her. We were doing all right. Then the raid started. He didn't specify who. It didn't matter. They were a force of chaos, of fire and death, that swept through the high country every few years. A storm was coming in, a big one. A few of our horses had gotten spooked and run off. I went after them. I told Mabel to lock herself in the root cellar if she saw dust on the horizon. Not the barn. Never the barn. He stopped, his throat tight. He swallowed. The sound loud in the quiet room. I was delayed. The horses had gone farther than I thought. I was riding back when I saw the smoke, a thick, black pillar against the gray storm clouds. He didn't have to describe the frantic ride, the desperate hope warring with a sickening certainty. The house was untouched, but the barn was an inferno. I found her, inside. She hadn't gone to the cellar. She had gone to the barn to save her mare. The main beam had collapsed. He fell silent. The guilt was a living thing inside him, a cactus with 1,000 needles, its roots wrapped around his heart. For 5 years, it had been his constant companion. The what-ifs were a litany he recited every night. What if I had left earlier? What if I had ridden faster? What if I had sold that damn mare? I was too late, he whispered, the words a confession he had never spoken to another living soul. I was supposed to protect her, and I was too late. He looked up and met Nayeli's eyes. In their dark depths, he saw not pity, but a profound, sorrowful understanding. She had lost her family to fire and violence. He had lost his. She was hunted for a crime she didn't commit. He was haunted by a failure that was his alone. Their tragedies were different in every detail, but the shape of their grief was the same. The empty space left behind, the cold weight of what if, pain, he realized, was a universal language. It didn't care about the color of a person's skin, or the god they prayed to. It just found a home and settled in. A long moment passed, the only sound, the soft hiss of the embers. Then, Nayeli asked the question that had been lying beneath all the others. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the cabin's shadows. "If I had been a white woman," she asked, her gaze unwavering, "down in that well, would you have cut the rope?" The question was a test. A knife blade laid against the fragile thread of trust between them. She was asking if he had saved her, or if he had just saved a victim. She was asking him to look past the event and into his own heart. Morgan considered it. He didn't offer a quick, easy answer. He thought of the girl in the well, the raw injustice of it. He thought of Mabel in the burning barn. He thought of the simple animal instinct to help a creature in pain. He leaned forward, the firelight catching the weary lines on his face. "I wasn't looking at your skin. Nayeli." he said, his voice low and certain. "I was looking at the life inside it. That's what I cut the rope for." It was the truest thing he had ever said. In that moment, she was not an Apache girl, not a fugitive, not a complication. She was the life that he had been too late to save before. The tension in her shoulders, a tension she had carried for so long it had become a part of her, seemed to dissolve. A slow, deep breath escaped her lips, a sigh that carried the weight of 100 sleepless nights. She moved, a slow, deliberate motion. She pushed herself up slightly and leaned across the small space between them, and then she pressed her forehead against his. The touch was electric. His skin was rough with stubble, hers was smooth and cool. It was not a kiss. It was something more profound. It was an offering of trust. It was an acceptance of his truth. It was two solitudes, touching in the dark, finding that they were not, after all, alone. He closed his eyes, his own forehead pressing back. A silent answer, a wordless vow. They stayed that way for a long time. Two survivors finding a moment of harbor in the storm. The world outside falling away until there was only the warmth of their shared breath, the faint glow of the embers, and the steady, quiet beat of two hearts. It was in that moment of stillness that his eyes, now open again, drifted past her shoulder. They fell on the rough-hewn table against the wall, and on the table, half curled from the dry air, was his unfinished map. It was nothing official, just a sheet of tanned hide he'd been scratching on for months. A map of his own property, the Lone Juniper Ranch. But it wasn't just boundary lines. He had been tracing something else, a pattern he had noticed in the way the cottonwoods grew, the places where the grass stayed green the longest into the dry season. He had been mapping the path of the underground spring, a powerful, hidden artery of water that flowed deep beneath his land, surfacing only briefly at his well before disappearing again into the earth. He saw the lines on the map. He saw Nayeli's face, inches from his. He saw the wanted poster in his mind's eye, Ransom Pike, Red Mesa, and suddenly, all the broken pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just about a frame-up. It wasn't just about getting rid of her people to grab their land. Pike's ranch was in the high country, dry country, but a man with knowledge, a man with a military surveyor's eye, might know about the aquifer, an underground river that ran right through Red Mesa, and through Lone Juniper. Water, in this land, was more precious than gold. It was power. It was the future. To control that water, you needed the land, all of it. You'd have to clear out the Firebird people, and you'd have to get rid of the quiet, solitary rancher who sat right on top of the source, a man who might not even know the true value of what he had. Until now, they weren't just after her. They were after him, too. She wasn't just bait for her people. She was a message, a warning, and now, a liability that connected all of them. He pulled back slightly, his mind racing with the new, terrifying clarity. She looked at him, a question in her eyes. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The path forward was unspoken, but clear. Survive. Get her to safety. And then they would see. Justice was a long, hard road, and they were just taking the first steps. He reached over and turned down the wick on the lantern. The flame sputtered, shrank, and died, plunging the room into near total darkness, leaving only the faint, pulsing red of the coals. In the sudden quiet, in the shared dark, another sound emerged, clear and steady, the beating of their hearts, no longer a prelude, but the first two notes of the song to come. The revelation of the water map settled between them, a heavy, unspoken truth. It was a new, more dangerous piece of the puzzle, and it meant the quiet cabin of Lone Juniper was no longer a sanctuary. It was the epicenter. The understanding hung in the air, thick with dread, and as if the sky itself was responding to the weight of their discovery. The wind died, and the rain began. It didn't start as a storm. It was a slow, hesitant tapping, like a traveler asking for entry. A few drops, then a dozen. Within minutes, It became a steady, relentless drumbeat on the new tin roof Morgan had installed just last fall. Tap, tap, tat, 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 tat. It was a sound that should have been comforting, a sound that meant life for the parched land. But tonight, it was a sound that sealed them in, isolating them in their small, firelit room. A tiny island of warmth in an ocean of cold. Hostile darkness. The fire in the hearth, which had been a comfort, now seemed to fight against the encroaching chill. The rain brought a dampness that seeped through the chinking in the logs, and the wind, picking up again, rattled the single glass pane of the window. Nayeli stood near the hearth, but she was not looking at the flames. She was wrapped in the thin sheet she had used for privacy, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. A shiver ran through her, a tremor that was visible even in the dim light. It was not just the cold. Morgan knew that shiver. It was the body's reckoning with fear, the delayed shock of Crane's visit, the terrifying weight of the $500 bounty, and the fresh horror of her own relived memories. The danger was no longer an abstract they in the distance. It had a face, a name, and a tin star. Morgan watched her from his stool. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her gaze darted to the door every time the wind gusted, as if expecting Crane and his men to burst through it, the rain their cover. He, too, felt the cabin's vulnerability. The log walls felt thin as paper. He stood, the motion drawing her sharp. Immediate attention. Her hand twitched, as if reaching for the knife that was no longer on the shelf but tucked into the sash at her waist. "It's just the cold," he said, his voice low, not wanting to startle her further. He walked to the foot of his bed. There lay the heavy Navajo wool blanket, Mary's blanket. It was the last, best piece of her he owned, a weave of deep reds and blacks, thick and warm. He had given it to Nayeli on her first night, and she had folded it neatly back on the bed each morning. A silent, respectful gesture. He picked it up. It was heavy in his arms, a tangible weight of warmth and memory. He stepped toward her. She flinched, a small, involuntary movement, her eyes widening. He stopped, holding the blanket out, a silent offering. He was not just offering warmth, he was offering a space. She did not move. She just watched him, her breathing shallow. He took one more slow step, until he was standing just in front of her. The space between them was electric, charged with everything unsaid, with the confessions of the night. Gently, so as not to spook her, he unfolded the heavy wool. He didn't just hand it to her. He raised it and, in a single, fluid motion, draped it over her shoulders. And then, he did the thing that changed the air in the room. He didn't step back. He stepped in, bringing the other side of the blanket around his own shoulders. Now they stood together under the same covering, a small tent of shared warmth. The space between them shrank from arm's length to a mere whisper. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, smell the faint, clean scent of the bear grease on her healing wounds, mixed with the dusty, herbal scent that was uniquely hers. She was so close he could see the individual threads of her dark eyelashes, the way the firelight caught the moisture in her eyes. She was rigid, her whole body tensed, her back straight as a pine. He felt her shiver again, a violent tremor that passed from her body into his through the wool. He stood perfectly still, his hands holding the edges of the blanket, not touching her, just holding the shelter around them. He let her feel his stillness. He let her know this was not an advance, but a bracing, a sharing of the load. He could feel her breath, quick and unsteady, hitting his collarbone. "You're safe," he whispered, the words barely audible over the drumming of the rain. "He's not coming tonight. No one's riding in this." She said nothing, but he felt her tremble lessen, just a fraction. She was so close, yet still 1,000 miles away, trapped in the well, in the burning lodge, in the fear. He could feel the battle inside her, the instinct to flee warring with the exhaustion that craved rest. And then, her voice, so small he almost missed it, a vibration more than a sound. "Stay close." It was a plea. He didn't move. He just waited. A tear spilled from her closed eye and tracked down her cheek. "Closer," she begged, the word a tiny, broken thing. It was not the request of a lover. It was the desperate, foundational plea of a human being who had been left alone in the dark for too long. It was the first time she had allowed herself to ask for safety. His own heart, a slow, heavy thing, seemed to crack. He closed his eyes and did as she asked. He leaned in, slowly, and pressed his forehead to hers. The contact was a jolt, skin to skin, his rough, hers smooth. It was an anchor. It was the touch he had offered in the dark hours before, a gesture of shared grief. Now, it was a gesture of shared life. He could feel her eyelashes fluttering against his cheek. He could feel the frantic pulse in her temple. He let his breath out in a long, slow sigh, trying to lend her his own calm, to breathe his steadiness into her. He felt her own breath hitch, and then, for the first time, she inhaled deeply, matching his rhythm. One breath, then another. The rain hammered the roof, the wind moaned, and in their small, shared space, there were only two foreheads touching, and two people breathing as one. His hand, the one that had held the blanket, moved. He brought it up, slowly, his calloused, rough fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a touch as light as a feather. She did not pull away. He cupped the back of her head, his fingers threading into her thick, soft hair. He held her skull, a gesture of profound protection, his thumb resting just behind her ear. And then he stopped. His hand was a question. His breath was a question. He was asking her, in the only language they had, if this was allowed. Her answer was not a word. It was a sound, a low, soft sigh that came from the deepest part of her. Her body, which had been rigid as stone, softened. Her shoulders sagged, and she leaned into his touch, her weight, just for a second, resting against him. Her hand, which had been clenched at her side, came up and rested on his chest. Her fingers splayed over his shirt. She was not pushing him away. She was holding on. It was all the permission he needed. He tilted his head. His nose brushed her cheek. A soft, accidental caress. She turned her face toward his, a small, seeking motion. And then he kissed her. It was not the kiss of a man starved for affection. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of certainty. It was slow. It was as gentle as his hands had been when he cleaned her wounds. It was a promise, a statement. I am here. You are real. You are alive. Her lips were dry, chapped from the well, but warm. She was perfectly still for a heartbeat, a moment of pure, startled surprise. This was not a man's touch as she had known it. This was not violence. This was not taking. And then she responded. Her lips softened under his. It was a slow unfolding, a yielding. Her breath, which they had been sharing, now mingled, their exhalations becoming one. It was rain meeting dry earth. It was a parched throat finding water. It was the most natural, necessary thing in the world. His other arm, which had been holding the blanket, moved. It wrapped around her waist, pulling her not with force, but with an irresistible gravity, until her front was pressed against his, the blanket cocooning them both. Her hand on his chest clenched, her fingers gripping his shirt. His hand in her hair held her steady. The kiss deepened, but it never hurried. It was a long, slow exploration, a relearning of what a touch could be. He could taste the salt of her tears, the faint, dusty taste of the corn mush she'd had for supper, and she could taste the faint, lingering traces of coffee and wood smoke on him. It was a kiss that grounded them, anchoring them to the present moment, pushing away the ghosts of Pike and Crane, of Mabel and the burning lodge. When they finally broke apart, they didn't move away. They stayed, foreheads touching again, their breath coming in shaky, shared gasps. They were both trembling now, not from cold, but from the powerful, terrifying intimacy of what had just passed between them. A small, choked sound came from her. It was a laugh, or maybe a sob. I am still alive, she whispered, as if the realization was brand new. Yes, he whispered back, his voice thick. We are. He felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him, so strong it made his chest ache. Thank you, he murmured, for being here. She pulled back just enough to look at him. The firelight was soft, carving his face from the shadows. His gray eyes, usually so guarded and weary, were open, clear, and fixed on her. A small, shy, and utterly disbelieving smile touched the corner of her mouth. It was the first time he had seen her smile. It was like watching a desert flower bloom in the dead of night. He couldn't help it. A small, rusty smile of his own answered hers. It was an awkward, foreign expression on his face, but it was real. In this small, ridiculous cabin, with a storm raging and killers on their trail, they had found this. She seemed to find courage in his smile. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and then, as if seeing it for the first time, her gaze dropped to his chest, to where her hand rested. Her fingers moved, tracing a line on his shirt. Beneath the cotton, her fingertips brushed against a ridge of raised, old tissue. A scar. It ran from his collarbone down toward his heart. She looked up at him, her eyes asking the question. Old, he said. A branding iron a long time ago. A dispute over a maverick calf. Some men think what they can't have, they can burn. She touched the scar again, her fingers gentle, tracing its path through the fabric. Then she pressed her palm flat against it, flat against his chest. She held it there, covering his old wound, and beneath her hand, steady as the rain on the roof, was the solid, powerful thump, thump, thump of his heart. She closed her eyes, letting that steady beat travel up her arm, a rhythm of reassurance, a message that said, I am solid. I am here. I am alive. He held her, his arm a protective shield across her back, his hand still cradling her head. He looked past her, at the log wall. The firelight cast their shadows onto the wood. Before, they had been two distinct, separate shapes. Now, wrapped in the blanket, held in an embrace, their silhouettes had merged. They were one single, dark form, swaying slightly in time with their breathing. It looked, he thought, like a dance, a slow, silent waltz, with the percussion of the rain as their only music. The fire in the hearth began to die. The big logs crumbled into a bed of glowing coals, and the light in the room dimmed, the corners filling with shadows. The warmth of the room began torridy, but the warmth inside their wool cocoon only intensified. They stood like that for a long time, simply holding each other. The fear was still there, outside the door. The bounty was still real. The danger was still waiting with the dawn. But in this moment, they were safe. He felt her body go heavy against him, the last of her tension finally releasing. Her exhaustion complete. She was asleep on her feet. Gently, he guided her toward his bed. He didn't let go of her. He sat on the edge of the mattress and pulled her down with him, so they were sitting side by side, still wrapped in the blanket. He leaned back against the wall, pulling her with him, until she was tucked against his side, her head resting on his shoulder. He pulled the blanket up, tucking it securely around them both. The fire was just a dull red glow now, the cabin almost dark. The rain on the roof was a lullaby. She sighed in her sleep, her hand, which had been on his chest, sliding down to find her fingers, small and strong, intertwined with his larger, rougher ones, their hands clasped, a tight, unbreakable grip. He looked down at her dark head resting on his shoulder. He felt a fierce, protective surge so powerful it stole his breath. He had no grand promises to offer. He had no plan for forever. He only had the next few hours. He leaned his head down, his lips brushing the top of her hair. Still be here in this morning, he whispered. A promise not to the future, but to the present. He closed his eyes. Their clasped hands rested on the blanket between them. Outside, the rain continued to fall, a steady, cleansing sound, washing the dust from the air, softening the hard edges of the unforgiving world. And for the first time in 5 years, Morgan Hale did not feel alone. The morning broke cold and sharp. The world washed clean by the night's rain. The sky was a high, polished blue, and the air smelled of wet creosote and damp earth. The intimacy of the night, their shared warmth under the blanket, had settled between Morgan and Naomi, but it had not banished the danger. It had, instead, given it a focus. It had given them something to lose. The new, terrible knowledge of the aquifer pulsed beneath them like a second heart. Morgan was no longer just a widower hiding from his ghosts. He was a man sitting on a fortune he never knew he had. A fortune that Ransom Pike, the railroad, and a hired army of Pinkertons were willing to kill for. And Naomi was not just a framed fugitive. She was the first domino they had tried to topple, the living witness to the fire that started it all. They couldn't run. Running would mean surrendering the water, the land, and any chance of justice. Running would be an admission of guilt. "I have to ride out," Morgan said, his voice flat in the cold morning air. He was checking the cinch on Gideon, his movements economical and precise. "I need to see a man in San Gabriel." Naomi stood in the cabin doorway. The Navajo blanket wrapped around her. Her ankle was still stiff, but she stood on her own. "They will be watching the town," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'll go in from the Arroyo side. Father Ortez, he's the only one I trust." He looked at her, his gaze holding hers. "Bar the door. Keep the rifle. Don't light a fire unless you have to. And don't go outside." She nodded, her hand moving to the hilt of the skinning knife at her waist. "I will be the shadow in the window." He mounted Gideon and rode out, not toward the north road, but west, into the broken, rocky country, looping miles out of his way to approach the small mission from the south. The San Gabriel Chapel was not a grand building. It was a small, humble structure of sun-baked adobe, its white walls stained with red dust, its bell hanging silently in a simple wooden frame. It was a place of quiet, a sanctuary for the few souls, white and native and Mexican, who scratched out a living in this hard land. Its keeper was Father Ortez, a small, wrinkled man with eyes that had seen too much and a faith that had, against all odds, endured. He was a man who believed that God saw everything, but that sometimes God needed a man on earth to keep the records. Morgan found him sweeping the packed earth plaza in front of the chapel. The priest stopped, his broom still, as Morgan dismounted. "Morgan Hale," Ortez said, his voice a dry rustle. "It has been a long time since you sought grace. I thought you had found your own." "I'm not here for confession, Father," Morgan said, his voice low. "I'm here for your books, the parish register." Ortez's dark eyes searched Morgan's face. He knew this was not a social call. "The register is for births, baptisms, deaths, not for whatever it is you are hunting." "I'm hunting a murderer," Morgan said flatly. "Ransom Pike." The priest's face did not change, but his grip tightened on the broom. "Those are heavy words, my son. To accuse a man who has just buried his wife, and an entire village at Red Mesa," Morgan countered. "I need to know about the night Eliza Pike died." "I know you keep notes. You see everything." For a long moment, Ortez stood still. Then he nodded. "God's house is open, but so are his eyes." He led Morgan into the cool, dark interior of the chapel. It smelled of old wax, dry herbs, and dust. In a small sacristy, a room lined with shelves, he pulled down a massive, leather-bound book, the parish register. He laid it on a scarred wooden table and opened it, his fingers thin as bird talons. Turning the brittle pages, he went back, past the recent entries, to the last moon of winter. He stopped, his finger landing on an entry. "The night of Senora Pike's passing," he murmured. He turned the book for Morgan to see. Ortez's script was small, precise. The entry was dated, and beside the formal notation of the death, there was a personal note, scribbled in the margin, 1 A.M. R. Pike arrived at the chapel, agitated, smelling of spirits, demanded sanctuary. He had fresh scratches on his hands and neck, deep as from resistance. He spoke of a terrible accident, then of an insurance policy. He was not a man grieving. He was a man afraid of being caught. Morgan's blood ran cold. It was the proof. Pike hadn't been at home. A grieving husband. He'd been here, drunk and scratched, babbling about insurance. But that is not all, Father Ortez said, his voice heavy with sorrow. He pointed to the bottom of the page. It was jagged, torn. A section of the page, nearly a quarter of it, had been ripped out. Who did this? Morgan's voice was a low growl. A man came 2 days after. He said he was from the Territorial Marshal's office. He asked to see the register, to verify the date of death. I'm an old man. He was fast. Ortez looked at Morgan. He was not a marshal. He wore a city suit, and his eyes were cold, like a hawk's. But he was not as careful as he thought. The priest continued. He reached to a small shelf and picked up his own well-worn Bible. Tucked inside the pages was a small, triangular scrap of paper. It was still caught in the spine of the register. He missed it. He handed the scrap to Morgan. It was tiny, but the words, in the same ink as Pike's entry, were clear. One word, partial surance policy. To be claimed, and below it, a distinctive, flowing signature, half torn, but legible Curtin Detective Agency, Pinkerton. The final piece, Pike, his wife's murder, an insurance policy, and the Pinkertons, all in the same note. They are not just detectives, Morgan said, his mind racing, fitting the pieces together. They are enforcers. Pike and the railroad, they're working together. The railroad, Ortez sighed. The Llano Spur. They believe they are paving the road to salvation, but they are paving it with the bones of good people. They want the land, Morgan. But why your land you have nothing? That's where you're wrong. Father, Morgan said, the grim reality settling on him. I have water. He left the chapel with the scrap of paper tucked deep in his pocket. He rode not home, but to Coyote's mercy. The town was buzzing. The $500 bounty on Nayeli had, as Crane predicted, made everyone observant. Men who usually just lounged on the boardwalk now stood in watchful groups, their eyes scanning every rider, every wagon. They looked at Morgan, their gazes lingering. He was a known recluse. His sudden appearance was an event. He ignored them. He rode directly to the one new building in town, a hastily constructed wooden storefront with a garish sign, the Llano Spur Railroad Company, land prospecting. In the window, just as he'd feared, was a new map. It was large, professionally drawn, and arrogant. It showed the proposed route of the railway, a thick black line cutting through the territory. Morgan's eyes traced it. It ran north of Red Mesa, then veered sharply south, cutting a straight, unnatural path directly through the middle of his property. The line ran precisely over the area where he had mapped the aquifer. They knew. His next stop was the county land office, a dusty, single-room affair run by a clerk who was more asleep than awake. Morgan went in, pretending to check on his tax assessment, while the clerk rummaged in a back room. Morgan moved to the large plat book on the main counter. He flipped to his section. His hands clenched. It was there, a new survey, filed just 2 weeks ago. The boundary stakes had been moved, on paper, at least. A section of his northern pasture, the part where the well and the spring were strongest, had been reallocated, ceded to the public domain for railroad right-of-way. It was a legal, bloodless theft. He memorized the coordinates, the new lines, the dates. He burned the image into his mind. This was the second piece of evidence, the theft on paper. He walked out of the office, his face a stone mask, and rode out of Coyote's mercy, the greedy, watchful eyes of the town following him all the way. When he got back to Lone Juniper, the sun was low, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and bruised purple. The cabin was dark. The bar was in place. He gave the low, 2-note whistle of a canyon wren. The bar slid back. Nayeli stood in the darkness, the rifle in her hands. She lowered it when she saw him, the relief on her face so profound it was like a physical blow. That night, they worked. The time for hiding was over. The time for fortification had begun. Morgan, using his memory of the land office map and his own knowledge of the terrain, laid out the battlefield. "They'll come from one of three ways," he said, scratching lines in the dirt floor of the cabin. "Crane will bring them from the north, from the road. The Pinkertons, the professionals. They'll use the arroyo to the east, for cover. And Pike, if he's with them, he'll come from the high ground to the west, to watch. We have to be ready for all three." He spent hours outside, in the twilight. He didn't build walls. He built warnings. He took old tin cans and filled them with pebbles, stringing them on thin, taut wires across the three approaches. He rigged a small cluster of mule bells to the barn door, so it couldn't be opened without a clatter. He wasn't building a fortress to keep them out. He was building a spider's web to tell them when they stepped into it. As he worked, he watched Nayeli. She was not idle. Her ankle was still weak, but her spirit was iron. She had found a short, strong bow of Osage orange wood in his barn, left by a passing Ute years ago. It was stiff, but her arms were strong. She stood by the lone juniper tree, its ancient, gnarled branches her only witness. She drew the string back, her muscles straining, and let an arrow fly. It thwacked into the trunk of a dead cottonwood 50 yards away. She drew again and again. Her breath came in pants, her face set in a mask of concentration. She was fast. Then she unhooked the leather bola from her sash. Morgan had seen them before, but never used with such precision. She held the 3 weighted cords, her wrist rotating, a slow, whistling circle. Whir, then a snap of her arm. The bola flew, a spinning blurred trio of stones, and wrapped itself with a clack around a fence post. She was fast, and she was accurate. She was no longer a victim in a well. She was a hunter. When the moon was high and the tripwires were set, they met back at the well, the source of all their trouble. Morgan carried a small, iron-bound box, one that had held his wife's few possessions. It was empty now. Wordlessly, they placed their evidence inside. First, Morgan's hand-drawn map of the aquifer. The motive. Second, the brass .44 casing from the cavalryman scout. The proof of the hunt. Third, the torn scrap of paper from Father Ortez's register. The conspiracy, bearing Pike's name and the Pinkerton signature. Finally, Nayeli reached to her neck. She untied the leather thong and held the blue feather amulet in her hand, the symbol of the Firebird people. She looked at it, then placed it gently on top of the papers. The proof of who had been wronged. Morgan closed the lid. He had dug a hole earlier, beneath a large, flat witness stone that had lain beside the well for 100 years. Together, they lowered the box into the earth. They covered it and rolled the heavy stone back into place. It was a grave for their secrets, and an ark for their truth. They stood, side by side, looking at the stone. They had buried their past and their only hope for the future. They didn't need to speak the vow. It was in the set of Morgan's jaw, in the steady, cold fire in Nayeli's eyes. This was not about running anymore. This was about living long enough to unearth this box. It was about exposing the men who burned villages, stole water, and used the law to cover their tracks. The wind had been still all night, the air heavy and expectant. As they stood there, a new breeze kicked up, coming not from the cool west, but from the east. It was a hot, dry wind, and it carried something new. Morgan lifted his head, his nostrils flaring. Nayeli smelled it at the same time, her body going rigid. It was the smell of smoke, faint, distant, but unmistakable. It wasn't the clean scent of a pine or mesquite campfire. It was the acrid, oily smell of something unnatural, of buildings, or oil, or something burning. It was coming from the direction of Red Mesa. They weren't just coming for the ranch. They were already on the move. The human storm, the one they had been dreading, was no longer approaching. It was here. The distant smell of smoke was a ghost on the wind, a promise of the violence to come. It had been there since dawn, a faint, acrid taint that grew stronger as the sun climbed higher. Morgan and Nayeli didn't need to speak of it. They moved with a quiet, grim purpose. The unspoken knowledge a third presence in the small cabin. The fight was no longer a matter of if, but when. It came in the full, hot light of midday. 6 riders, resolving out of the heat haze on the North Road. They moved not with the stealth of scouts, but with the lumbering arrogance of a posse that believes its victory is assured. From the slit in the barn's hayloft, Morgan watched them come. He recognized Crane's bulky form on the tired sorrel, and beside him, a man on a fine black gelding who could only be Ransom Pike. Pike was leaner than Crane, with a ramrod straight posture and a face that seemed permanently set in a sneer. 4 other men, hard-faced riders with rifles held casually across their saddles, fanned out behind them, hired guns, Pinkertons, or men who wished they were. Nayeli was a silent shadow beside him, her short bow held loosely in her hand, an arrow already nocked. Her breathing was slow and steady. The terror he had seen in her was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus that was more dangerous than any rage. The riders pulled up just beyond the muddy patch of yard Morgan had spent the morning creating. He had unstopped the irrigation ditch that fed his small vegetable garden, letting the water spill out and saturate the hard-packed earth in front of the cabin and barn, turning it into a slick, treacherous morass of red mud. Crane, puffed up with his own authority, held up a piece of paper. "Morgan Hale," he bellowed, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "By the authority of the territory of New Mexico, we're here to conduct a search of these premises for the good of the community." It was a flimsy pretense, a lie so thin it was transparent. There was no territorial marshal, no circuit judge's seal on that paper. It was a warrant written by greed and signed by a gun. Morgan stepped out of the barn, his hands empty and held away from his body. He walked to the edge of the mud patch, his boots sinking slightly. "You've got no authority here, Crane," he called back, his voice flat and calm. "This is private land. Turn your horses and ride out." Pike spurred his horse forward, nudging it to the very edge of the mud, his eyes, small and black as beads of oil, fixed on Morgan. "We're looking for a fugitive, Hale, an Apache murderer. The $500 reward says we have all the authority we need. Now, are you going to let us search your barn, or are we going to have to tear it down?" Morgan gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. "You're not setting foot on my property." It was the signal. Pike snarled an order, and the 6 riders urged their horses forward, into the yard. The effect was immediate and chaotic. The horses, expecting solid ground, hit the slick, deep mud. The first horse, a big bay, went down on its forelegs with a panicked squeal, tossing its rider into the mire. Another horse shied violently, its back legs sliding out from under it. Pike's expensive gelding, trained for parades not bogs, bucked and fought for purchase, its powerful hooves churning the mud into a thick, flying spray. In that first moment of confusion, as men cursed and fought to control their panicked mounts, Nayeli acted. She rose from the hayloft window, a silhouette against the dark interior of the barn. She drew her bow not at the men, but at the sky. A single arrow, fletched with a turkey feather, flew in a high arc. It wasn't an attack. It was a signal. It landed with a soft thump in the roof of the cabin. The sound was followed by a sharp, metallic clatter from the arroyo to the east. One of the Pinkertons, trying to circle the barn, had ridden straight into Morgan's tripwire. The string of tin cans rattled and danced. A crude but effective alarm. And that sound, in turn, spooked the cattle. Morgan's small herd of 20 longhorns, penned in the corral behind the barn, had been agitated all morning. The alarm was the final straw. With a collective bellow of panic, the lead steer lowered its horns and crashed against the old wooden fence. The sun-bleached rails, already weakened by Morgan that morning, splintered and gave way. The herd exploded from the corral, a tide of muscle, horn, and terror, stampeding directly toward the struggling riders in the muddy yard. The scene dissolved into pure pandemonium. Men shouted, horses screamed, cattle bellowed. The hired guns, who had been focused on Morgan, were now fighting for their lives against a ton of panicked beef. One man was unseated, his rifle flying into the mud. Pike was forced to wheel his horse. narrowly avoiding the horns of a charging steer. In the midst of the chaos, Hollis Crane showed his true colors. He wasn't a lawman, he was an arsonist. He managed to get his sorrel under control and pulled a torch, a thick stick wrapped in oil-soaked rags, from his saddlebag. He struck a lucifer against his saddle horn, and the torch flared to life. "If you won't let us in, we'll burn you out!" he screamed, his face a mask of fury. He spurred his horse toward the barn, holding the torch high, his eyes fixed on the open hayloft door. On the dry, waiting tinder within, from her perch, Nayeli watched him come. He was looking up, his face illuminated by the torchlight. A perfect target. She didn't reach for another arrow. She reached for her bola. With a practiced, fluid motion, she began to swing it, the 3 weighted stones a blurred, whistling circle in the air. As Crane raised his arm to throw the torch, she released it. The bola flew, a spinning, deadly bird. It did not strike his head or his chest. It whipped around his upraised arm, the leather cords tangling, the stones clacking together with the sound of breaking bones. The torch flew from his grasp, landing harmlessly in the mud with a hiss. The force of the blow, the sudden, violent stop of his arm, unbalanced him. With a cry of pain and surprise, he toppled sideways from the saddle and landed with a heavy splash in the mire. At the same time, Morgan moved. While the others were distracted by the cattle and Crane's fall, he saw Pike dismount, his face a thundercloud of rage. Pike drew a heavy dragoon pistol and started slogging through the mud toward the barn, toward Morgan. Morgan didn't have a gun in his hand, but he had the barn. He backed into the doorway as Pike approached, his pistol raised. "You should have left her in the well, Hale," Pike roared, his boots making sucking sounds in the mud. "She wasn't yours to leave," Morgan shot back. Pike raised the pistol to fire, but as he did, Morgan reached out and grabbed the heavy iron chain that was used to bar the barn door from the inside. He yanked it hard, the staple holding it to the doorframe, old and rusted, ripped free from the wood. Suddenly, Morgan was holding 4 feet of heavy, linked iron. As Pike leveled his pistol, Morgan swung the chain in a low, horizontal arc. It was not a whip, it was a net. The chain wrapped itself around Pike's gun arm, the cold iron clanking against the steel of the pistol. Morgan yanked again. Hard. Pike, off balance in the mud, was pulled forward. His fingers squeezed the trigger, and the dragoon pistol fired with a deafening roar, the bullet plowing harmlessly into the barn's doorframe. Before Pike could recover, Morgan dropped the chain, stepped forward, and drove his fist into the rancher's jaw. Pike's head snapped back, and he stumbled, falling backward into the mud, the pistol slipping from his grasp. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. Crane was on the ground, clutching his arm and groaning. Pike was disarmed and dazed. The cattle had scattered, but the hired guns had had enough. They were paid to intimidate, not to fight a 2-front war against a rancher and his own livestock. Seeing their leaders down and the situation spiraling out of control, they made a business decision. One of them helped Crane to his feet, while another retrieved Pike's pistol. They dragged the 2 men back to their horses, their faces a mixture of fury and grudging respect. "This ain't over. Hale!" One of the Pinkertons shouted, his face grim. "We'll be back, and next time, we'll have a real warrant and a dozen more men." They mounted, dragging Pike and Crane with them, and retreated the way they had come, leaving a yard churned into a battlefield of mud, broken fences, and the lingering smell of gunpowder and fear. Morgan stood, breathing heavily, his knuckles raw. Nayeli climbed down from the hayloft, her face pale but her eyes blazing. They looked at each other across the ruined yard. They had won the battle, but the Pinkertons' threat hung in the air. They had only bought themselves a little time. Then they saw the smoke. It wasn't from Crane's dropped torch. It was coming from the side of the barn. In the chaos, a stray spark from the torch must have landed on a pile of dry hay near the wall. A small, hungry flame was licking its way up the dry timber, smoke pouring from the eaves. Morgan grabbed a horse blanket and the water bucket. For the next hour, they fought the fire, a desperate, silent battle against the encroaching destruction. They managed to save the barn, but not before the fire consumed half of the roof and a significant portion of the hayloft. The smoke rose into the blue sky, a black, greasy column, a signal to the whole territory that Lone Juniper had been touched by violence. When it was over, they stood in the yard, covered in soot and grime, and looked at the scorched, blackened timbers. The message was clear. They had defended their home, but they could not stay. The next time, there would be more men. The next time, they would not be so lucky. Morgan turned to Nayeli, his face grim. "Go inside. Get the water skin, the compass from the shelf, all the ammunition." His voice was low. Final. "We leave tonight." She didn't argue. She just nodded, her gaze moving from the burned barn to the ancient, solitary juniper tree that stood by the well, its branches a dark, intricate pattern against the sky. It was the only home she had known since the fire at Red Mesa. He saw the loss in her eyes, the understanding that they had just lost this small piece of ground, this brief sanctuary. But when her eyes met his again, he saw something else. Too, a fierce, unwavering resolve. They had lost the house, but they had not lost each other. As she went inside, Morgan walked the perimeter of his land one last time, near the well, half buried in the mud. He saw it, a piece of weathered wood. He knelt and pulled it from the muck. It was the sign. The letters, scrawled in charcoal, were faded but still legible. "White men don't forgive." He stared at it, at the hatred it represented, the lie that had started all of this. He carried it to the smoldering remains of the barn wall. He found a still glowing ember and held the corner of the plank to it. The dry wood caught immediately. The flame licked at the letters, turning the words of hate into black ash, until the entire sign was consumed, disappearing into a puff of smoke on the evening wind. He would not allow that poison to follow them. An hour later, under a sky full of stars, they were ready. Gideon and Mary's mare were saddled, the bags packed with their meager supplies. They did not look back at the scorched barn or the dark cabin. Before they mounted, Nayeli did something strange. She took 2 small, brass bells from her pouch bells used in ceremonies to call the spirits, and tied one to the tail of each horse with a strip of leather. They made a soft, tinny, almost mournful sound in the quiet. "Why?" Morgan asked. "It is a funeral procession," she said softly. "We are escorting the ghosts of our old lives away from this place." He understood. He swung into Gideon's saddle. Nayeli, moving with a new, fluid grace, mounted the mare. They nudged their horses forward, the small bells a soft, chiming lament in the vast silence. As they cleared the ridge and looked down at the dark shape of the ranch for the last time, the moon rose. It was a sliver, a thin, sharp crescent, like the curved blade of a skinning knife. It cut a path of pale, cold light across the dark land, severing their past from the unknown, dangerous future that lay ahead. They did not ride for the road. They plunged south, into the broken labyrinthine country of the high mesas, a land of sheer rock and shadow, a place where maps were useless and only the sun and stars could offer direction. Their first sanctuary was a scar in the earth known as the Devil's Ribbon, a slot canyon so narrow in places they had to ride single file, the rock walls rising 500 feet straight up, blotting out the sky. They moved in the canyon's bony, perpetual shadow. The only sounds were the soft shush of their horses' hooves in the sand, the creak of saddle leather, and the tiny, mournful jingle-jingle of the funeral bells Nayeli had tied to their horses' tails. The sound was eerie, a tiny lament echoing off the towering walls of red rock, a soundtrack for their own burial. Morgan rode in the lead, rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the rimrock far above, searching for any movement. Nayeli followed, her gaze constantly flickering behind them, her body poised, her short bow in her hand. On the second morning, high on the southern rim, she saw it, a flash of light, not a reflection off water. It was sharp, deliberate, and metallic. Flash, flash, flash. Pause, flash. Heliograph, Morgan said, his voice a low growl. He didn't need to look. He'd seen them used by the Army survey teams. Pinkertons, professionals, 2 of them, by the tracks I saw near the wash. They are talking, Nayeli whispered, her eyes fixed on the distant glint. To who? Crane, Morgan said, and Pike. The professionals are the hounds, keeping us moving. Crane and his rabble are the net, closing in. The canyon walls fell away abruptly, spitting them out onto the blinding, brutal expanse of the Pychon salt flats. It was a white, cracked hell, a prehistoric lakebed that stretched for 20 miles, shimmering under a merciless sun. There was no cover, no shadows, no place to hide. They were 2 dark specks moving across a vast, white plate. We have to cross, Morgan said, his voice tight. It's the only way south. We'll ride hard. They spurred their horses into a ground-eating lope, the animals' hooves kicking up clouds of stinging, alkaline dust. They were a perfect target, and the hunters knew it. Far behind them, 2 riders emerged from the canyon, silhouetted against the dark rock. They didn't hurry. They raised their rifles, the sun glinting on the long barrels. A puff of white smoke, a high, thin whee that seemed to take seconds to cross the distance, followed by the sharp crack of the rifle. The shot was high. They were finding the range. Faster, Morgan yelled. Another crack. This time, Morgan felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through his left side. It was as if a branding iron had been laid against his ribs. He grunted, his body lurching in the saddle. Morgan! Nayeli's voice was sharp with alarm. It's a graze. He grit out, his teeth clenched. Keep moving. Don't stop. He could feel the warm, wet stickiness spreading under his shirt. The world was starting to swim at the edges, the white salt flat tilting. Another shot kicked up a plume of white dust just in front of Gideon. And then, salvation. The wind, which had been a hot, steady breath, suddenly gusted, a violent roaring force from the west. Within minutes, the air was full of grit and sand. The salt flat, which had been crystal clear, dissolved into a screaming, opaque wall of white dust. The wind-driven salt stung their faces like needles, and the world was reduced to a howling, blinding chaos. Get down! Nayeli screamed over the roar. She was off her mare, pulling the Navajo blanket from her saddle roll. She ran to the small watering hole at the edge of the flat, a briny, shallow puddle, and plunged the blanket in, soaking it. Morgan slid from his saddle, his sides screaming in protest, a dark stain spreading on his shirt. Nayeli ran to him, dragging the heavy, wet blanket. She threw it over the heads of both horses, who were panicking in the wind, their eyes wide. The wet wool muffled their whickers of terror and, more importantly, trapped the steam of their breath, making them invisible in the swirling dust. Get under, she commanded, pulling him down behind the horses' bodies, huddling against the relative shelter of their legs. She pushed her face into Gideon's flank and pulled Morgan close, his back against her. They were blind, deafened by the wind, but they were hidden. The world was a screaming, white void. They stayed there for what felt like an eternity, the dust storm raging around them. The hunters would be blind, too, forced to hunker down and wait. When the wind finally began to subside, hours later, the world was a different color, painted in the pale, ghostly light of a dust-filled twilight. The Pinkertons were gone. Nayeli didn't wait. Your side, she said, her voice all business. Morgan leaned against Gideon, his face pale and slick with sweat. He lifted his shirt. The bullet had torn a shallow, 4-inch furrow along his ribs, ripping the skin and muscle. It was bleeding sluggishly, but it was not deep. He had been lucky. Nayeli's face was grim in the fading light. She took her skinning knife, heated the blade in the flame of a lucifer to clean it, and then, with a sharp, quick motion, sliced 2 long, thin strips of rawhide from his saddle strings. She soaked them in water from the canteen, making them pliable. Then, taking a pad of cloth from her saddlebag, she pressed it hard against the wound. This will hurt, she said. She wrapped the wet rawhide strips around his torso. Over the pad, pulling them so tight he cried out, his breath hissing between his teeth. The rawhide was a living bandage. As it dried, it would shrink, applying relentless, perfect pressure to the wound, sealing it better than any stitches. "It will hold," she said, "but we must find water, and we must rest." They rode into the night, Morgan swaying in the saddle, his body a solid block of fire. Nayeli led them, her eyes on the stars, guiding them toward a place she remembered from her childhood. They left the salt flats and entered a jumble of black volcanic rock. Just before dawn, she found it a dark crack at the base of a cliff, half hidden by overgrown mesquite, the entrance to a cave. Inside, the air was cool and damp. A steady drip, drip, drip echoed in the darkness. It was agua sorda, deaf water, a small, limestone cavern where water seeped from the rock, gathering in a shallow, crystal-clear pool. They watered the horses, then drank themselves. The cold, clean water a miracle. Morgan slumped against the cave wall, his body finally surrendering to the pain and exhaustion. Nayeli posted herself at the mouth of the cave, a dark shape against the graying light, her bow across her knees. They heard the riders just after sunrise, 2 of them, the Pinkertons. They were moving slow, picking their way through the volcanic rock. They passed so close to the cave entrance that Morgan could hear the clink of a horseshoe on stone, the low murmur of their voices. He could hear the heavy, sharp sound of their cavalry boots on the rock outside, a sound like dry hail on a tin roof. Morgan and Nayeli didn't breathe. They sat in the dripping, watery darkness, listening as their hunters walked past, so close they could have touched them. The boot steps faded. They were safe. For now. They stayed in the cave all that day. As darkness fell again, a fragile peace settled over them. They couldn't risk a fire. They sat near the mouth of the cave, under a vast, glittering canopy of stars, sharing a strip of dried beef. Morgan's side was a dull, throbbing ache, but the bleeding had stopped. The silence was companionable, no longer the tense, watchful silence of the cabin. "The clouds," Nayeli whispered, pointing to a thin, feathery wisp high in the atmosphere. "They move fast, from the west. That means wind tomorrow. But they are high and thin. Not a storm. Good weather for riding." She pointed to the North Star. "My father called that one the nail that holds the sky. It does not move. As long as we can see it, we are not lost." She taught him how to read the patterns of the stars, how to smell the direction of the wind, how to tell the coming of a storm from the feel of the air. In return, he took out his folded, water-stained map. In the dim starlight, he pointed to the words, "This says Sierra Madre. That's the mountains we're heading for. This one." He pointed, his finger tracing the letters. "Is Rio Grande, the river." He taught her the shapes of the letters, River, Mountain. He taught her how to read the name Pike and the word wanted. She learned with a fierce, quick intelligence, her finger tracing the shapes in the dark, her lips forming the strange, foreign sounds. They were 2 scholars in a fugitive university, exchanging the knowledge of their separate worlds. In the middle of their quiet lesson, a small, gray fox, its brushy tail magnificent in the moonlight, trotted boldly into their camp. It snatched the last piece of jerky from the rock between them and vanished into the shadows, all in a single, fluid motion. They stared at the empty rock. Then, Nayeli let out a small, choked sound. It was a laugh, a real, quiet, breathy laugh. Morgan looked at her, and the absurdity of it, the killers behind them, the wound in his side, the stolen meat hit him. A low, rusty chuckle rumbled in his own chest. It hurt his ribs, but he couldn't stop it. They laughed, a shared, silent, desperate laugh, their shoulders shaking in the starlight. It was the first moment of pure, unadulterated humanity they had shared. A small, bright spark in the overwhelming dark. At dawn, they were moving again. Morgan checked the trail of the Pinkertons, and his blood ran cold. The track's 2 horses, shod. One with that distinctive nick he remembered from the well simply stopped. They hadn't turned back. They hadn't circled. They had vanished into the rocks. "They know this land," Nayeli said, her face grim as she studied the ground. "Or they have a guide. They are not behind us anymore." Morgan understood. "They're in front of us." "An ambush," she said. She pointed to the south. The only passable route forward was a narrow, winding pass through a collection of bell-shaped hills. "La Campana, the bell. It's a trap. They will be on the ridges." Morgan's heart sank. They were pinned. But Nayeli was already thinking, "We don't go through the pass. We go around, through the dry riverbed." She pointed to a deep, winding arroyo that cut east, a treacherous path of sand and rock. It would add a day to their journey, but it would be out of sight of the pass. "And we give them something to hunt." She pulled the leather thong from her neck. The blue feather amulet, the symbol of her people, lay in her palm. For a moment, she stared at it, her face a mask of sorrow. Then, with a quick, decisive motion, she tied it to the leg of a jackrabbit she had snared earlier. She set the rabbit loose, slapping its hindquarters. It bolted, terrified, straight toward the mouth of La Campana, the blue feathers a bright, confusing flash of color against the red dirt. "They will see it," she said. "They will think I dropped it. They will think we are in the pass." But she wasn't done. She dismounted and found a cluster of prickly pear cactus, its fruit a deep, blood red. She sliced one open, mashing the pulp in her hands. She smeared the dark, crimson juice on the rocks at the entrance to the pass, then dripped a trail of it, as if from a bleeding wound. A false blood trail. "You're wounded," she said, her eyes glinting with a cold, hard brilliance. "They will follow this. It leads to the cienega." She pointed to a patch of dark green in the distance. "A swamp. Their horses will be belly deep in mud before they know it." They didn't wait to see if the ruse worked. They led their horses into the deep arroyo and began the slow, painful detour. They were no longer the hunted. They were the hunters. It took them a full day and a night, but they made it. They emerged from the arroyo onto the high plateau that marked the border of the Sierra Madre. The air was different here, thinner, smelling of pine and altitude. They were close, but the sky, which had been clear, was now changing. To the west, a massive, bruised purple wall of clouds was building, churning like a herd of stampeding buffalo. A storm was coming. And at the far end of the plateau, guarding the final trail into the mountains, was a checkpoint, a collection of rocks that formed a natural gateway. They were walking the horses, giving them a rest. Morgan sighed a stiff, throbbing agony. When Nayeli suddenly stopped, she grabbed his arm, her fingers biting into his muscle. "Listen." The wind was moaning through the rocks, but beneath it, he heard it. The faint clink of a rifle's hammer being pulled back. They were waiting. The Pinkertons hadn't taken the bait. Or worse, there were more of them. A shot exploded from the rocks ahead. It was early. The shooter was nervous. The bullet shrieked past Morgan's ear. So close, he felt its heat. "Down!" Morgan roared. He didn't think. He reacted. He grabbed Nayeli by the waist and dove sideways, tackling her off her feet, his wounded side exploding in pain. They crashed to the ground behind a low-lying boulder, just as a second and a third shot ripped through the air where they had been standing. The rocky ground around them erupted in puffs of dust, like corn popping over a hot fire. They were pinned, the final gateway to freedom blocked by an unseen, deadly enemy. The world exploded in a shower of rock dust and the shriek of a ricochet. Morgan rolled, pulling Nayeli with him, his wounded side screaming a protest that was lost in the thunder of the gunshots. They were pinned, the final gateway to the mountains. A shooting gallery. It wasn't just the two Pinkertons. He could see them now. 4 men, spread out in the rocks, rifles glinting in the late afternoon sun. They had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted. "They drove us here," Nayeli gasped, her face pressed into the dirt. "They knew we would come this way." Morgan risked a glance over the boulder. A bullet whined past his head, smacking into the rock with a vicious thwack. He saw the horses, tethered behind the ambushers, and behind them, coming up the trail, were more riders. A posse, Crane, Pike, and at least 6 others. The net had closed. There was no escape. They could stay here and die, trading shots until they were overwhelmed, or they could surrender. The choice was grim. Dying here served nothing. The box of evidence would remain buried, their story untold. "Don't shoot!" Morgan called out, his voice hoarse. He laid his rifle on the ground and pushed it out from behind the boulder. He saw Nayeli's eyes flash with protest, but then she saw the grim logic in his. She slowly, reluctantly, placed her bow beside his rifle. "We're coming out," Morgan shouted. "Hold your fire." He rose first, his hands held high. Nayeli followed, her face a mask of cold fury, her chin held high in defiance. The Pinkertons emerged from the rocks, their rifles trained on them. A moment later, Crane and Pike rode up, their face triumphant. "Well, well," Crane drawled, a greasy, satisfied smile spreading across his face. "Look what the cat dragged in, or what we dragged out of the rocks, the little lovebirds." Pike's eyes were full of venom. He stared at Morgan, then at Nayeli. "You should have died in that well." He spat at her. "And you." He turned to Morgan. "Should have minded your own damn business. Now your business is a rope." They were bound, their hands tied in front of them, and forced to walk the long, humiliating journey back to Coyote's mercy. They were paraded down the town's single dusty street like trophies, the townsfolk emerging from the saloon and the general store to stare. Morgan could see the greed in their eyes, the mental calculation of their share of the $500. He saw pity in some, but fear kept their mouths shut. They were thrown not into a cell. Coyote's mercy was too small for such a luxury, but into the blacksmith's shed, a hot, dark space that smelled of coal smoke and horse sweat. They sat in the dirt, their backs against the wall, and waited for the mockery of justice that was sure to come. But justice, it turned out, had a way of arriving in unexpected forms. Late that afternoon, a buckboard rattled into town. Driving it was Father Ortez, and beside him sat a tall, severe-looking man with a shock of gray hair and a long, black coat. This was Circuit Judge Elias Baines, a man known throughout the territory for his sharp mind and his even sharper intolerance for frontier foolishness. His arrival was a coincidence so profound it felt like a miracle. He had been on his way to Santa Fe when Ortez had intercepted him, pleading a case of grave injustice. Baines did not believe in waiting for ceremony. Court was convened on the spot, on the wide, covered porch of the general store. 2 barrels were set up as a judge's bench, 5 men from the town, a storekeeper, 2 prospectors, a blacksmith, and a nervous young telegraph operator were conscripted as a jury. The entire town gathered in the dusty street to watch. Morgan and Nayeli were marched onto the porch, their bonds still in place. Pike and Crane stood opposite them, looking smug and confident. Judge Baines slammed a heavy law book onto the barrelhead, the thump silencing the murmuring crowd. "This is not a formal trial," he announced, his voice a powerful baritone that carried over the street. "This is a preliminary hearing. I will hear accusations, I will hear defenses, and I will determine if there is cause to hold these prisoners for the territorial court. Mr. Crane, you may begin." Crane swaggered forward. "Your Honor, this is an open and shut case. This Apache woman," he pointed a thick finger at Nayeli, "is wanted for the murder of the Honorable Eliza Pike and for the arson of a military outpost. The bounty is $500. This man, Morgan Hale, has been harboring this fugitive, and in doing so has brought violence and danger to our community, as evidenced by the clear signs of a gunfight and fire at his ranch." Pike stepped up beside him. "He's a menace, Your Honor. His land should be forfeit, seized for the public good. He's clearly unstable, consorting with a known killer." Baines listened, his face impassive. Then he turned his cool, gray eyes to Morgan. "Mr. Hale, your response." "The charges are lies," Morgan said, his voice quiet but steady. He looked not at Baines, but at the 5 men of the jury. All of them. Nayeli is not a murderer. She was a victim, left to die in a well on my property by men who work for Ransom Pike. A murmur went through the crowd. And as for my land, Morgan continued, Mr. Pike does not want it for the public good. He wants it for the water that runs beneath it. Pike laughed, a short, ugly bark. He's delirious. There's no water on that patch of dirt but what falls from the sky. Before this court proceeds, a quiet voice said. Father Ortez stepped forward from the crowd, his large, leather-bound parish register in his hands. I believe this may be of interest. Baines nodded. The court recognizes Father Ortez. The priest laid the heavy book on the barrel. I keep the records of this parish. Your Honor, births, deaths, and visitors. He opened the book to the page he had shown Morgan. On the night of Eliza Pike's death, her husband, Ransom Pike, arrived at my chapel. He was not grieving. He was terrified. He had scratches on his hands and neck. Pike's face went white. Lies, the ramblings of an old man. My notes are quite clear, Ortez said calmly. He spoke of an insurance policy, a policy that, I have since learned, would not pay out in the case of a family dispute. The priest then held up the small, torn scrap of paper Morgan had given him. And a page of my register was torn out by a man claiming to be a marshal. He was not as thorough as he thought. Ortez carefully placed the scrap against the jagged edge of the torn page. It fit perfectly. The words "Surance Policy" and the signature of the Curtin Detective Agency were now plain for all to see. The crowd gasped. The link between Pike, his wife's death, and the Pinkertons was now a physical fact. Furthermore, Ortez continued, his voice ringing with moral authority, while the seal of the confessional is sacred and inviolable, I can say this: the information I received that night was enough to cast the gravest possible doubt on the story, Mr. Pike has told the world. The implication was devastating. The jury members looked at each other, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning suspicion. I have more, Morgan said, stepping forward. He held up the small, brass .44 casing. I found this near my property, left by a scout. It's from a cavalry issue sidearm. A Colt Dragoon. Perhaps? He looked directly at Hollis Crane. The same model of sidearm you carry on your hip right now, Deputy. Crane's hand instinctively went to his pistol. He looked flustered. Lots of men carry a .44 inches. And there's the matter of the survey. Morgan pressed on, his voice gaining strength. 2 weeks ago, a new survey of my land was filed at the county office. It illegally cedes my northern pasture, the land directly over the aquifer, to the railroad. A survey signed and witnessed by a man in the employ of Ransom Pike. This is an outrage, Pike bellowed, his face turning a deep, apoplectic red. These are lies and fabrications. Is it a fabrication, Mr. Pike? A new voice called out from the crowd. A small, ink-stained man pushed his way forward. It was Elias Thorne, the town's printer. In his hand, he held a printed leaflet. Your Honor, Thorne said, his voice trembling slightly. Mr. Pike's associates from the Llano Spur Company hired me to print these flyers a month ago, for recruitment. He handed the flyer to Judge Baines. Baines read it aloud, his voice cold and clear. Seeking able-bodied men for security detail. Llano Spur Railroad. Tasked with the pacification of hostile elements and securing the water route along the Red Mesa line. Contracts overseen by the Pinkerton Detective Agency. All inquiries to be directed to Foreman R. Pike. Silence. A dead, heavy silence fell over the street. The conspiracy was no longer a theory. It was printed in black ink. The $500 bounty was not about justice. It was about silencing a witness. The attack on Morgan's ranch was not about harboring a fugitive. It was about a land grab. The faces of the jury were no longer confused. They were angry. The fire of greed in the town's eyes was being replaced by the slow burn of having been played for fools. It was too much for Ransom Pike. His arrogance, his entitlement. His entire world was crumbling around him on a dusty porch in front of a crowd of people he considered his inferiors. With a primal roar of rage, he did the one thing that proved his guilt more than any piece of evidence. He drew his gun. He leveled the heavy pistol not at Morgan, but at Father Ortez. "You sanctimonious old goat, you broke your vows," Crane, seeing the situation exploding, drew his own pistol, perhaps to fire a warning shot, perhaps to join the fight. The crowd screamed and surged backward, but before either man could fire, something moved with impossible speed. Nayeli, who had been standing silent and still, acted. Her hands, though bound, were free, in a single, fluid motion. She unhooked the bola from her sash. With a flick of her wrist, it spun, a whistling, blurred circle. She didn't aim for Pike. She aimed for his gun. The bola flew, the weighted stone striking Pike's pistol with a sharp crack. The gun flew from his grasp, clattering onto the wooden porch. In the same motion, the leather cords whipped around, entangling Crane's gun hand, pulling his shot wide. The bullet ripped harmlessly into the sign of the general store. The porch exploded into chaos. The blacksmith on the jury, a giant of a man, lunged forward and tackled Pike to the ground. Morgan drove his shoulder into Crane, sending him stumbling back into the porch railing. "Order!" Judge Baines's voice boomed over the pandemonium, backed by the solid, definitive click-click of him cocking the massive Colt Patterson he had produced from beneath his coat. "Order in this court." The sight of the judge's 5-shot pistol had an immediate calming effect. The crowd froze. "Mr. Pike, Mr. Crane," Baines said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You are under arrest for threatening a man of the cloth, for discharging a firearm in a public assembly, and for suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder. Blacksmith, bind these men. Use their own cuffs." The blacksmith grinned and did as he was told. Securing Pike and Crane to the porch railing, Baines turned to Morgan and Nayeli. He looked at the wanted poster, then at Nayeli's proud, defiant face. "This hearing is suspended," he declared. "However, the bounty on this woman, issued by the territorial government, is still technically in effect. I cannot legally nullify it without a full confession or irrefutable proof of her innocence." He paused, his gaze thoughtful. "But I can postpone its enforcement." That night, as a cool, misty rain began to fall, Morgan and Nayeli were released. They were given a conditional freedom. "You cannot stay in this county," Baines told them in the quiet of his temporary office. "Pike's money runs deep. The Pinkertons will not forget this. The hearing is postponed for 1 month. If you are not back by then with the final piece of evidence, you need to clear her name completely. I will have no choice but to enforce the warrant." He was giving them a chance, a head start, a quest. They stood at the edge of the town, the lights of the saloon a hazy glow behind them. The rain was a fine, soft mist, clinging to their clothes and hair. It was just like the night in the cabin, the night they had first truly connected. "He's giving us enough rope to save ourselves, or hang ourselves," Morgan said, looking out into the dark, wet expanse. Nayeli looked back at the town, then to the south, the direction of escape. But she did not look at it with the eyes of a fugitive. "We are not running anymore," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Morgan looked at her, at the strength that seemed to radiate from her small frame. He nodded. "No, not anymore." He knew what they had to do. They had the motive. They had the conspiracy. But they needed the final, irrefutable proof of the Red Mesa fire. The proof that would not just free her, but condemn Pike forever. "We go back," Morgan said, his voice a vow in the rainy dark. "We go back when we have the last piece." Together, they turned their gaze to the east, toward the dark, unseen silhouette of the high mesas, toward Red Mesa, toward the place where the truth still lay, buried under a blanket of ash and lies. The journey to Red Mesa was a pilgrimage into a graveyard. They rode under the cold, pre-dawn stars, the silence broken only by the soft jingle of the funeral bells on their horses' tails and the sigh of the wind through the piñon pines. This was not the land of their flight, a landscape of fear and escape. This was Nayeli's home, and they were returning to a place of ghosts. They arrived as the first sliver of sun crested the eastern horizon, bathing the mesa in a pale, ethereal light. The ruins of the Firebird people's camp were a collection of dark, skeletal shapes against the morning sky. Charred lodge poles pointed like accusing fingers at the heavens. The ground was a carpet of gray ash, dotted with the poignant, heartbreaking detritus of a destroyed life, a shattered clay pot, the scorched metal of a cooking pan, a child's bead that winked in the new light. Nayeli dismounted, her movements slow and reverent. She walked through the ashes of her past, her face a mask of sorrow so profound it seemed to have been carved from the rock of the mesa itself. Morgan stayed back, giving her this moment, his hand resting on Gideon's neck, his heart a heavy stone in his chest. She stopped at the center of what had been their small village. Before the largest, most deeply blackened pole, it was the remains of the council lodge. "My father," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound in the vast silence. He would hang his trading beads here after a good journey, a prayer of thanks to the spirits of the mountain. She knelt in the ash. Her fingers, which had been so steady with a bow and a bola, now trembled as they began to dig. She dug with a desperate, focused energy, her hands scooping away the layers of ash and burned earth. Morgan dismounted and came to stand beside her, a silent guardian. Her fingers hit something hard, not a rock. It was smooth, cylindrical, with a final, gentle clearing of the dirt. She lifted it from the earth. It was a tube of thick, oiled rawhide, about a foot long, sealed at both ends with plugs of hardened pine pitch. A faint, intricate design of a bird in flight was tooled into its surface. She held it in her hands as if it were a living thing. With the tip of her knife, she carefully broke the seal on one end. She tipped the tube, and from it slid a tightly rolled bundle of tanned deerskin, tied with a sinew cord. She unrolled it on the ground. The inner side was covered in a series of intricate, pictographic drawings in red and black ink. It was a history, the story of her people, the Firebird clan. There were drawings of their first treaty with the Spanish missionaries, the symbols of their trade agreements with the first, honest ranchers who had settled this land. It was their constitution, their deed, their very identity. Tucked into the last fold of the deerskin was another, smaller piece of paper. It was not deerskin. It was a receipt, a flimsy piece of paper from the general store in Coyote's Mercy. The storekeeper's spidery script was clear. The date on the receipt was from the day before the fire. The items listed were 2 large tins of pine oil and a bundle of cotton rags. And the name at the bottom, signed with a flourish of arrogant confidence, was Ransom Pike. It was the final piece, the proof, not just of the murder, but of the cold, calculated premeditation of the destruction of an entire people, all for a hidden river of water. Nayeli looked up at Morgan, her eyes shimmering with tears, but not of sorrow. They were tears of vindication. Their journey back was a tense, silent race against the clock. They had the proof, but it was worthless if they couldn't get it to Judge Baines. They pushed the horses hard, their eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines. As they entered a narrow canyon, a shortcut back toward the plains, Morgan's instincts screamed. He reined Gideon to a sharp halt, a single rifle shot cracked from the rocks above, the bullet kicking up a spray of gravel just in front of Gideon's hooves. They were ambushed. A lone rider, a Pinkerton left behind as a last line of defense, blocked their path. "That's far enough," a voice echoed down the canyon. "The game's over. Drop the rifles." Morgan and Nayeli backed their horses into the cover of a thicket of overgrown sagebrush. They were pinned, but they were not the same 2 people who had fled their ranch. They had been forged into something new in the crucible of their flight. "The wind," Nayeli whispered, her eyes on the dry brush. "It's blowing toward him." Morgan understood instantly. He pulled a lucifer from his vest. "Get ready," he said. He struck the match and tossed it into the heart of a large, dry sagebrush. The bush, full of volatile oils, went up with a sudden, explosive whoosh. A thick, acrid cloud of gray smoke billowed upward, carried by the wind, straight toward the Pinkerton's perch. The gunman cursed, his vision obscured. He fired 2 more shots, blindly, into the smoke, under the cover of the chaos. Morgan and Nayeli dismounted. "Go low," Morgan whispered. They crawled on their hands and knees, through a thick patch of thorny greasewood, circling around the gunman's position. The smoke was their shield. The gunmen's panicked. Sporadic shots were their guide. They came up behind him. He was a young man, his face tense, squinting into the smoke. He was so focused on the spot where they had been that he never heard them. Morgan rose up behind him, a silent shadow. He didn't use a gun. He slammed the barrel of his rifle into the back of the man's head. The Pinkerton crumpled without a sound. They disarmed him, tied him securely, and left him for the buzzards or the law to find. Their path was clear. The town of Coyote's Mercy was a tinderbox of anticipation when they rode in. Word of the suspended hearing had spread, and the entire populace was gathered once again in front of the general store. Judge Baines sat at his barrel-top bench, his face grim. Pike and Crane stood under guard, their expressions a mixture of arrogance and a new, creeping fear. Morgan and Nayeli walked onto the porch. Morgan was no longer a haunted recluse. He stood tall, his gaze steady. Nayeli was not a fugitive. She was a queen, returning to claim her justice. The hearing reopened. Father Ortez was the first to speak. Nayeli handed him the sealed leather tube. "Your Honor," the priest said, his voice ringing with conviction. "I have seen this seal before. It is the tribal seal of the Firebird people, used to ratify their treaty with my own predecessor a generation ago. It is authentic." Then came the town blacksmith, the man who had served on the jury. "Your Honor," he boomed. "After the last hearing, something was bothering me. About 6 weeks back, Mr. Pike here," he gestured to the rancher, "paid me to make him a special tool, a grappling hook, he said, for pulling a calf out of a ravine." The blacksmith produced a heavy, 3-pronged iron hook. "When I heard about the fire, I went out to the storehouse at the Pike Ranch, the one where he kept his oil. The marks on the forced storeroom door, they match this hook perfectly." Finally, Morgan stepped forward. He unrolled the deerskin, revealing the tribal history, then placed the small, damning receipt on the barrelhead in front of the judge. "This is a receipt for pine oil and rags," he said, his voice clear and strong. "Purchased by Ransom Pike the day before he burned Red Mesa to the ground." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The final nail had been hammered into the coffin of Pike's lies. Judge Baines picked up the receipt. He looked at Pike, whose face had turned the color of ash. He looked at Crane, who seemed to shrink inside his dusty coat. "Ransom Pike, Hollis Crane," Baines declared, his voice like the crack of doom. "You are to be bound in irons and held for the territorial court on charges of murder, arson, conspiracy, and perjury. The $500 bounty on this woman," he gestured to Nayeli, "is hereby nullified, and the fraudulent survey of Mr. Hale's land is void." He looked at the Pinkerton representatives who had been observing from the back. "As for your agency," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "I would advise you to withdraw your contracts and your men from this territory before I have you all arrested for aiding and abetting." The Pinkertons, seeing their investment turn to dust, did not argue. They melted back into the crowd, their involvement in Coyote's Mercy officially over. As the blacksmith led Pike and Crane away in chains, a remarkable thing happened. The townspeople, the same people who had stared with greed and suspicion, now moved. They parted, forming 2 silent, respectful lines, creating a clear path from the porch to the street. And as Nayeli walked through them, her head held high, the sun caught the small, blue feather amulet she had retrieved from the Pinkerton and now wore once more around her neck. It seemed to glow with an inner light. She was no longer a squaw. She was a survivor. She was their conscience. That evening, they returned to Lone Juniper. The scorched timbers of the barn stood black against the sunset. The cabin was a dark, silent shell. It was a place of ghosts, but they were their ghosts. Father Ortez came with them, and as the stars began to appear in the velvet sky, he stood with them under the ancient gnarled branches of the lone juniper tree. A few friends they had made in town, the blacksmith, the printer, stood as witnesses. The only music was the gentle squeak of the weather vane on the well, a sound that was no longer a complaint, but a bell. They said their vows, simple words that carried the weight of everything they had endured, and after Father Ortez pronounced them man and wife, Nayeli turned to Morgan. She looked up at him, her eyes full of a light that outshone the stars. She reached up and pulled his head down, her voice a soft, possessive whisper. "Stay close." She pressed her forehead to his. "Closer." And he kissed her. It was a long, slow kiss, unhurried and deep. It was not a kiss of discovery, but a kiss of coming home. It was a vow made not with words, but with breath and warmth and the silent, steady beating of two hearts that had, against all odds, found their rhythm together. The next day, they began to rebuild. Their first act was to take up shovels and dig a new ditch, diverting the powerful flow of the underground spring out onto the thirsty land. For the first time in seasons, the parched earth drank its fill. A handful of stray calves, drawn by the scent of water, returned to the ranch, there lowing a sound of contentment. From the ashes of the burned barn, they salvaged the good timber. They began to build a new house, a house with 2 rooms, with a porch that faced the sunrise, and on the main crossbeam above the doorway, Morgan, with Nayeli guiding his hand, carved a single, elegant bird, its wings spread wide, wreathed in a corona of stylized flames. The firebird, not a symbol of destruction, but of rebirth, a beacon to guide them home. The seasons turned, the land healed, they healed with it. One evening, as a spectacular, blood-red sunset painted the western sky, they stood in their yard, the ground still soft with mud from the afternoon rain. A soft breeze blew, and from somewhere in the new barn, a mule bell tinkled. Morgan took Nayeli's hand. He pulled her close, and they began to dance. A slow, clumsy waltz in their mud-caked boots. They weren't graceful, but they were smiling, their quiet laughter mixing with the song of the evening crickets. The camera of the mind pulls back, showing 2 small figures, turning slowly in the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving landscape. The border was no longer a line to be run from. It was the horizon of a life they had chosen to stay and build. Together. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel. Wild West Stories 1850, give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners like you.